Section 1. The Night That Changed Everything. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city at night, not a city in chaos, not yet. Picture it as it was before, a medium-sized American city in the Midwest, the kind of place that never makes national news, the kind of place people are born in and quietly stay in because the cost of living is reasonable, and the summers are warm, and the streets feel familiar in the way that only your own streets ever can. Raccoon City, population around 100,000. A city with a downtown and a river. A city with a university and a police department and a hospital. A city with a clock tower that locals take for granted after a while, the way you stop seeing the things that have always been there. Now imagine it is late September. The year is 1998. The leaves are turning, deep amber and rust red, drifting from the maples that line the older residential streets. There is a chill in the air that wasn't there a week ago, the kind of chill that arrives overnight like a quiet announcement that summer is finally finished. The sky above Raccoon City is wide and dark and full of stars on the clearest nights. And on those nights you might stand on your porch and feel, briefly, that everything in the world is fine. It isn't fine. Beneath that sky, beneath those amber leaves, beneath those familiar streets, something has already gone terribly wrong. It went wrong quietly, the way the worst things always do. Not with a bang or a broadcast, not with a government warning or an emergency alert flashing across television screens. It went wrong in the water, in the rats, in the slow, invisible spread of a pathogen that no one in the city was aware of, because the people responsible for that pathogen had spent years making absolutely certain no one would ever find out about it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as the story allows. The night that most people would point to as the true start of the end came on September 29th, 1998. By that point, the city had already been dying for a week. The outbreak had already claimed countless lives in the residential districts to the west. The hospital was overwhelmed. The phone lines were jammed. Some people had gotten out, families packing cars in the middle of the night, driving until the city lights faded in their rearview mirrors. Some people had barricaded themselves in their homes and were waiting, with a certainty that was becoming harder to maintain, for the authorities to come and tell them it was going to be all right. The authorities were not coming, not in any meaningful way. The government knew, the military knew. Behind closed doors and in classified briefings and in the controlled, cautious language of men who understand that panic is its own kind of danger, decisions were being made about Raccoon City that its citizens would never be consulted about. Decisions that had already been made, in some sense. Decisions that were simply waiting for the moment when the math became undeniable. But that moment had not yet arrived on September 29th. The city was still standing, in the way a condemned building is still standing. Structurally present, but fundamentally already gone. And on that night, on that particular night in late September, with the chill in the air and the amber leaves on the ground, two young people arrived at the edges of a city they didn't know was already dead. They came from different directions and for different reasons, and they didn't know each other, and they wouldn't find each other right away. But their paths were already converging in the way that paths sometimes do when the world has quietly arranged itself around a catastrophe. The first was a young man named Leon Scott Kennedy. He was 21 years old. He had dark hair and an earnest face, and a police uniform that was freshly pressed because he had pressed it himself that morning with particular care, the way you do when something matters. It was supposed to be his first day. He had been assigned to the Raccoon City Police Department, the famous RCPD, housed in that extraordinary building that had once been an art museum, and he had driven through the night to arrive on time because being on time mattered to him. Responsibility mattered to him. He had wanted to be a police officer for as long as he could clearly remember, and now he was one, and today was the day it became real. He was going to be magnificent at this job. He was certain of it, in the quiet, private way that 21-year-olds are certain of things before the world has had time to complicate their certainty. He didn't make it to work. He was still miles from the city center when he encountered his first infected. A man, or what had been a man, standing in the middle of the road in the orange wash of his headlights, head hanging, posture wrong, moving with that terrible shuffling purposelessness that would come to define everything Leon was about to experience. He stopped the car. He got out. He called out. The man turned and Leon saw the face, and something cold moved through him that he didn't have a name for yet. He would have a name for it before the night was over. Everyone who survived long enough developed their own private vocabulary for this thing. But in that first moment, standing in the dark road with the engine idling behind him, Leon Scott Kennedy only knew that something had gone profoundly, incomprehensibly wrong. He would be right about that, more right than he could possibly know. The second young person who arrived at Raccoon City's edges that night was a 20-year-old woman named Claire Redfield. She came on a motorcycle, which suited her. There was something about Claire that was fundamentally kinetic, forward-moving, unwilling to be still. She wore a red jacket that had become practically a part of her identity. Red, the color of urgency. Red, the color of someone who has decided they are going to be visible in the world, rather than careful about it. She had short hair and quick eyes and a way of moving through the world that suggested she had already, in her short life, learned how to handle herself when things went sideways. She was looking for her brother, Chris Redfield, older, soldier solid, the kind of man who communicates in action rather than words, had gone quiet. She had been calling. She had been writing. No answer. The last information she had was that he was connected to something happening in Raccoon City, something that had gone wrong in the mountains nearby, something involving the Umbrella Corporation, which was the name that kept appearing whenever she tried to track down where her brother was and why he wasn't answering. Umbrella, a pharmaceutical company, a company that had its fingers in everything in Raccoon City, the jobs, the politics, the research labs, the very air of the place. She had driven through the night because she wasn't the kind of person who waited. She reached the outskirts and found what Leon had found: chaos, confusion, the unraveling of the ordinary world happening in real time. A gas station attack, gunfire, the dead moving. She made it through the worst of the early chaos on luck and instinct, and the fact that she was, despite her youth, genuinely capable in a crisis, more capable than most people her age, thanks in part to growing up with a brother who had believed in practical preparedness and hadn't been shy about passing it on. And then, briefly, memorably, in the middle of all that chaos, Leon and Claire found each other, two strangers on the edge of a dying city, young and scared and determined, meeting in a moment of shared impossible circumstance. They didn't have time for proper introductions. They didn't have time for much beyond the immediate and overwhelming reality of what was happening around them. But they had time enough to recognize in each other something important, the quality of people who are going to try, even now, even here, even facing something that had no name yet and no clear limit and no obvious solution. They agreed to make it to the police station together. That was the plan. The police station was the plan, because when you are 21 and 20 and the world is ending, the places of institutional authority still carry weight. You still believe that somewhere in the structure of the systems you've grown up trusting, there is someone who knows what's happening and has a plan to fix it. There wasn't. But they didn't know that yet. They were separated almost immediately because the city had plans of its own. A tanker truck, one of those slow, vast vehicles that belongs to the ordinary mechanics of a city and suddenly seems grotesque in a context like this, came through and severed their path. And after that, it was each of them alone in the wreckage of Raccoon City, trying to make sense of a world that had come undone. This is where the story truly begins, not with the outbreak, not even with the decisions that caused the outbreak, though we will get to those. We will spend a great deal of time with those, because they matter. Because understanding how something this terrible could happen in a country with functioning institutions and regulatory agencies and a free press requires understanding the architecture of denial and corruption and raw ambition that made it possible. But we will get to those. We begin here, in the dark, in the dying city, with Leon going one way and Claire going another, both of them heading toward the same impossible destination, both of them carrying only what they brought with them and whatever they could find in the wreckage. It is a story about survival, yes. It is a story about monsters, yes. But more than either of those things, it is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to be protecting you have decided that you are acceptable collateral damage. When the systems built to serve and defend have been quietly hollowed out from the inside by interests that were never, not for a single day, interested in your survival. Raccoon City didn't fall in a night. It was dismantled over years, with great care, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. But we'll get to that. For now, the night, the leaves, the chill in the air, two young people on the edges of a city that is already, in every meaningful sense, gone. And neither of them knows it yet. Settle in. This is going to take a while, and what a story it is. If you're enjoying this, if the story is settling over you the way we hoped, slow and deep and full, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us what you're curious about, what you remember, what you want to understand. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. These stories take a long time to build, and knowing you're here makes all the difference. Now, let's go deeper. Section 2. The World Before the Fall, Raccoon City. To understand what Raccoon City became, you have to understand what Raccoon City was. Not the mythology, not the shorthand that the name eventually became in the years after 1998, when people used it as a reference point for catastrophe, the way earlier generations had used other city names as shorthand for other kinds of devastation. Before all of that, Raccoon City was simply a place, with a history and a geography and an economic identity that had evolved over decades the way all American cities evolve, through booms and contractions and the slow accumulation of decisions made by people who were mostly just trying to keep things going. It sat in the Arklay Mountains region of the American Midwest, the kind of geography that is beautiful in a way that takes time to appreciate. Not dramatic, not postcard-ready, but steady and wooded and full of a quiet permanence that comes from old rock and old trees and rivers that have been running in their same channels since before anyone had names for them. The mountains themselves were never tall enough to be famous, but they were tall enough to feel like a boundary, the kind of terrain that creates a certain insularity in the communities that grow up in its shadow. People from Raccoon City tended to stay in Raccoon City. It was the kind of place that held people, not through force, but through the gradual, comfortable weight of familiarity. The city had grown up around natural resources in the 19th century, timber mostly, and some mineral extraction, and the agricultural land that opened up in the valleys. By the early 20th century, it had diversified, as surviving cities do, and by mid-century, it had the profile of a dozen other medium-sized Midwestern cities. Some light manufacturing, a regional hospital, a university that drew enough students to keep the economy from becoming purely industrial, a civic pride that expressed itself in a well-maintained downtown, and a police department that the locals took seriously. The police department is worth pausing on because it will matter. The Raccoon City Police Department, the RCPD, was headquartered in a building that was, by any rational assessment, absurd. In the early 20th century, the city had constructed a grand municipal building on the Central Plaza, something with ambitions far beyond its actual civic function. Vaulted ceilings, ornate stonework, stained glass, the kind of architecture that announced itself as permanent and serious and unwilling to apologize for taking up space. For decades, it served as an art museum, housing a collection of regional and national works that the city quietly but genuinely prized. And then, in the late 20th century, when the RCPD outgrew its previous home, someone, and the identity of that someone is itself a small story about institutional ego, decided that the old museum was the ideal location for the new police headquarters. The art stayed, the exhibits remained, distributed across wings and corridors alongside evidence lockers and offices and interrogation rooms. It was, depending on your perspective, either a deeply eccentric civic decision or a monument to the ways in which institutions adapt without ever quite acknowledging the strangeness of what they've become. Detectives worked in rooms with Renaissance-style oil paintings on the walls. The holding cells were in a wing that had once housed a collection of medieval armor. The chief's office commanded a view of the central hall's grand staircase, which swept upward to a balcony that would have been completely at home in an opera house. This building will be important, remember it. But the RCPD, for all its architectural grandeur, was not what defined Raccoon City's identity in the last decades of the 20th century. What defined Raccoon City, what shaped its economy and its culture, and, ultimately, its fate, was the Umbrella Corporation. Umbrella. The name has a particular resonance now, but in 1998 it was simply the dominant employer in the region. the company whose logo appeared on everything from pharmaceutical products in the local drugstores to the sponsorship banners at civic events. Umbrella had arrived in Raccoon City decades earlier, with the quiet efficiency of a company that knows exactly what it's doing and had proceeded to make itself through a combination of genuine economic contribution and careful political cultivation, essentially indispensable to the life of the city. They employed thousands. They funded university research programs. They supported local charities and civic initiatives. They maintained a public face of benevolent pharmaceutical innovation, medicines that save lives, research that advances human understanding, the kind of corporate messaging that is specifically designed to prevent you from looking too closely at what happens behind the doors that aren't open to the public. Behind those doors, Umbrella was doing something else entirely. The company had been founded by Oswell Spencer, along with two colleagues, Edward Ashford and James Marcus, in the late 1960s, and from its earliest days it had been organized around a fundamental deception. The pharmaceutical products, the public research, the civic engagement, all of that was real, in the sense that it existed and functioned and generated revenue, but it was cover, scaffolding, the visible face of a company whose actual purpose had always been the development of biological weapons, and more specifically the development of what Umbrella researchers called viral research, the modification and weaponization of infectious agents in ways that had nothing to do with healing people and everything to do with creating new categories of threat. The progenitor virus was the foundation. Discovered in Africa in the late 1960s, found, in one of those coincidences of discovery that seem impossible in retrospect, growing in a rare flower in a specific valley, it was a naturally occurring pathogen with properties that Umbrella's founders immediately recognized as extraordinary. It interfaced with human DNA in ways that no naturally occurring virus had been observed to do. It didn't simply infect and replicate, it restructured, it transformed. The changes it induced in host organisms were profound and terrible, and, from a certain perspective, fascinating, in the way that things which have no business existing are sometimes fascinating. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus took the progenitor, and they built on it. They built research facilities. They recruited scientists. They established a corporate culture of secrecy and compartmentalization, and the specific kind of ethical vacancy that is almost never the result of individual moral failure, but rather the emergent property of a system specifically designed to prevent people from having to confront the full implications of what they're working on. In Raccoon City, that culture had been marinating for decades by 1998. It had soaked into the institutional fabric of the place in ways that were difficult to see from the inside. The city's political leadership, its mayor, its police chief, its various officials and administrators, had been carefully cultivated by Umbrella over the years. Not all of them were corrupt in the straightforward sense of having taken bribes. Some of them simply existed in a professional ecosystem, in which Umbrella's interests had been so thoroughly naturalized that serving those interests felt indistinguishable from doing their jobs well. But some of them were corrupt in the straightforward sense. The police chief, in particular, was a man named Brian Irons, and Brian Irons is a subject that deserves his own section, because his particular story is one of the darkest threads in the whole dark tapestry. But we will say this now. Irons knew what Umbrella was doing in Raccoon City. He knew more than most, and he had made a considered, deliberate decision to protect that secret in exchange for the things that Irons valued most, which were money and power and the ability to operate without oversight or consequence. The city beneath the city. That is what Raccoon City was in the years before the fall, a normal-looking American city with an extraordinary secret underneath it, quite literally underneath it. Because beneath the streets and the foundations and the limestone bedrock on which Raccoon City sat, Umbrella had spent years constructing something, a laboratory, the largest, most sophisticated biological research facility the company had ever built. They called it the Nest, the Neogenic Exogenous Soluble Tissue Laboratory, though the acronym was really just a way of making something feel technical and legitimate that was, in its essential nature, neither. The Nest was completed in 1991, after years of construction that had been hidden within the geological survey work and infrastructure maintenance that happens constantly beneath cities and that no one pays much attention to, because the men in the hard hats generally know what they're doing. The nest sat in the limestone below the industrial district, accessible through tunnels that connected to the sewage system and to certain structures on the surface that Umbrella controlled. It was vast, multiple levels, multiple research wings, housing for staff who worked long enough shifts that maintaining surface residences wasn't always practical. It had its own power systems, its own environmental controls, its own security apparatus, staffed by Umbrella's private military contractors, the Umbrella Security Service. It was, in every meaningful sense, a city within the city, and in the nest, in those carefully maintained underground laboratories with their recirculated air and their artificial lighting and their extraordinary protocols around contamination and security, the research that Umbrella had been building toward for 3 decades was finally converging on something that William Birkin had been working on for his entire adult life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The city above and the city below, the people going about their lives in the amber September light, buying groceries and taking their children to school and arguing about football and doing all the ordinary things that people do when they live in a place that feels like theirs, that feels continuous with the past and reasonably connected to a future. They didn't know about the nest. Most of them had never thought particularly hard about Umbrella beyond the level of economic gratitude. There were jobs, there was money in the local economy, things seemed fine. Things were not fine. The machinery of catastrophe had been in motion for a long time. By 1998, it was accelerating, driven by decisions being made in Umbrella's boardrooms and laboratories that had nothing to do with the welfare of the 100,000 people living above them. Decisions about research timelines and corporate rivalry, and the desperate, escalating pressure of a company that had invested everything in a secret that was getting harder and harder to keep. There is a particular quality to the silence before something terrible happens in a community. A retrospective quality. Afterward, people always describe it, always say that there was something, some unease they couldn't name, some sense that the air had changed. Perhaps that is true. Perhaps the body knows things before the mind catches up. Or perhaps it is simply a narrative we impose afterward because it is intolerable to believe that catastrophe arrives without announcement, without any chance to choose differently. Raccoon City, in early September 1998, was quiet. The leaves were beginning to turn. The university was starting a new semester. The RCPD was conducting its regular business. The Umbrella facilities in and around the city were operating on their regular schedules. And in the deep limestone below, in a facility that no one on the surface knew existed, a man named William Birkin was working through the night on the thing that would destroy everything. He always worked through the night. It was the only time the laboratory was quiet enough for him to think. Section 3. William Birkin. The genius who burned it all down. There is a particular kind of person who exists in the history of every great disaster. The kind whose extraordinary ability and extraordinary blindness are so thoroughly intertwined that you cannot isolate one from the other, cannot say, here the talent ends and here the catastrophe begins. They are gifted past the point of normal reckoning, and they know it, and that knowledge has become the filter through which they process every experience, every relationship, every moral question that the world places in front of them. William Birkin was this kind of person. He was born with the particular cognitive profile that institutions like Umbrella have always been good at identifying and acquiring young, the kind of intelligence that manifests early and dramatically, that makes formal schooling feel like waiting in a very slow line, that generates in its possessor a chronic impatience with the pace at which ordinary human institutions operate. He was brilliant in the specific, narrow way that a person can be brilliant when they have found the thing that their mind was built for and have organized their entire life around pursuing it. His thing was viruses, specifically the way viruses interact with living systems at the genetic level. The mechanisms by which a virus inserts its genetic material into a host cell and repurposes that cell's machinery. The extraordinary plasticity of viral evolution. The theoretical possibilities, which had been quietly circulating in certain research communities for decades, for viral engineering, for the deliberate modification of viral agents to produce specific effects in host organisms. Effects that went far beyond the traditional understanding of what a virus could do. Birkin joined Umbrella young, very young. There are accounts suggesting he was involved in Umbrella-affiliated research by his mid-teens, recruited by the company through one of the talent identification programs that Umbrella ran with great discretion and considerable success at universities and research institutions. By the time most of his peers were completing their undergraduate degrees, Birkin was already embedded in Umbrella's research apparatus, already beginning the work that would consume his life. He worked alongside a young woman named Annette, who would eventually become his wife. Annette was a scientist in her own right, accomplished, focused, with a particular strength in the organizational and theoretical frameworks that Birkin's more intuitive, expansive thinking sometimes skipped over. They were professionally compatible in the way that the best research partnerships are, each compensating for something in the other, each making the shared work better than either could have produced alone. Their personal relationship developed from their professional one, as relationships in high-pressure research environments often do, and eventually formalized into marriage and family. They had a daughter, Sherry. But we'll get to Sherry. The work Birkin was doing throughout the 1980s, during the decade in which he rose from a remarkable young recruit to the undisputed center of Umbrella's most sensitive biological research, was centered on what Umbrella internally designated as the G-Virus Project. To understand the G-Virus, you have to understand where it came from. And where it came from is a story that says something essential about the nature of the work Umbrella was conducting. In the late 1960s, when Spencer and Marcus and Ashford were in the early stages of their research with the progenitor virus, they had acquired a young test subject, a girl named Lisa Trevor. She was the daughter of George Trevor, the architect who had designed Spencer's private estate. George Trevor was invited to the estate and never left. Spencer had him quietly eliminated once the building was complete, to protect the secrecy of certain architectural elements. His wife and daughter were retained as test subjects. Lisa Trevor was subjected to progenitor virus testing for years, decades, exposed to multiple viral strains, injected with experimental compounds, subjected to procedures that no ethics board would ever have sanctioned because there was no ethics board. Umbrella had made certain of that. She survived when other subjects didn't, and the way she survived was extraordinary. Her body adapted, mutated, developed resistances, and then went beyond resistance, developed regenerative capabilities that exceeded anything in Umbrella's existing research data. She should have died. She kept living. And in the process of living, in the process of adapting to everything Umbrella threw at her over the course of years that became decades, her body produced something new, a retrovirus, isolated from her tissue samples by Birkin in 1988. He named it the Golgotha virus, G-virus. The properties of the G-virus were, from Birkin's perspective, extraordinary to the point of almost theological wonder. Where the T-virus, the primary strain that Umbrella had been developing from the progenitor, produced the reanimation of dead tissue and the degradation of cognitive function in its hosts, creating what became known as zombies in the crude shorthand of popular description, the G-virus did something fundamentally different. The G-virus transformed its host at a cellular level in real time. It drove continuous mutation, the host organism undergoing rapid, compulsive biological change, adapting and regenerating and growing in directions that the ordinary constraints of mammalian biology had never allowed for. The transformations were grotesque. The things that G-virus hosts became were not more human. They were not improvements in any recognizable sense. They were biological improvisations, organisms reorganizing themselves according to the logic of survival, stripped of everything that normally constrains it, piling on additional eyes and limbs and defensive structures in a furious, terrible creativity that had no endpoint, no form that was final, no rest. But from a theoretical standpoint, from the perspective of a man whose relationship with the ethical dimensions of his work was, to put it charitably, attenuated, the G-virus represented something profound. It was the proof of concept for the ultimate potential of viral engineering. Life itself, plastic and adaptable in ways that evolution normally takes millions of years to achieve, compressed into a single host organism, responding in real time. Birkin spent years refining it, years in the nest, below Raccoon City, working with the single-minded intensity of a person who has found the problem that they were born to solve. His relationship with Annette deepened and complicated over those years in the way that relationships do when both people are intensely committed to work that also happens to be secret from the rest of the world, a kind of intimacy that has no outside, no community of friends who can offer perspective, no conversations at dinner parties where you talk about what you do in the comfortable, socially legible way that most people use to maintain their sense of themselves as part of a broader human world. They had Sherry. And Sherry grew up in the context of that world, not in the nest itself, but near it, in Raccoon City, in a household shaped by parents whose emotional and intellectual energy was primarily directed toward a project she couldn't know about. She was a lonely child, perceptive and resourceful in the way that lonely children sometimes become, developing internal resources because external ones are unavailable. Meanwhile, in the nest, Birkin was approaching something, a completion, a version of the G-virus formula that was stable enough, documented enough, understood well enough that it could be transferred, which meant it could be manufactured, which meant it could be sold, which meant it could become, in Umbrella's business model, the product that justified all the decades of investment and all the catastrophes that had preceded it. Umbrella knew this, Spencer knew this, and Umbrella had decided, with the particular calculus of a corporation that has always understood its researchers as assets rather than as people, that the time had come to take the G-virus away from William Birkin. This was the decision that ended everything. Birkin had given his life, quite literally, in the sense that his life was the work and the work was his life, to this project. He had spent his formative years, his entire adult existence, his marriage, his presence as a father, all of it in service of completing this research. And now, Umbrella, the institution that had shaped him, was going to take it, send a team to collect the samples, move the research to a different facility under different oversight. Birkin would be compensated, in the sterile language of institutional asset transfer. He would be thanked, probably, and then the work would belong to Umbrella, in a way that it had always technically belonged to Umbrella, but that Birkin had never quite allowed himself to fully reckon with. He wasn't going to let that happen. What Birkin did next is, depending on the frame through which you view it, an act of insane desperation or an act of terrible logic. Both, probably. Most acts that end everything are both. He hid the G-virus samples, kept them on his person, made arrangements, or tried to make arrangements, to negotiate directly with the upper echelons of Umbrella over the terms of the transfer, using the samples as leverage. He believed he had something they needed. He believed that his value to them was sufficient protection. He was wrong about that. On September 22, 1998, a week before Leon and Claire arrived at the edges of the dying city, an Umbrella Special Forces unit entered the nest. They were the UBCS, the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, and they had a specific mandate: retrieve the G-virus samples from Birkin and neutralize any resistance. Neutralize. They shot him. A scientist, alone in his laboratory at night, surrounded by the equipment that had been the context of his entire existence. They shot him and took the samples and left him bleeding on the laboratory floor, which was the end of the transaction as they understood it. It was not the end. Birkin was dying. The samples were in their hands. He had nothing left. Nothing except the single vial of G-virus that he had hidden separately, the one they hadn't found, the one that had always been, in some corner of his catastrophically brilliant mind, the option of last resort. He injected himself. What happened next was not what Birkin imagined, in that dying moment it would be. He was a virologist. He understood theoretically what the G-virus did. But understanding a process intellectually and experiencing it is not the same thing, has never been the same thing. And whatever transformation Birkin imagined the virus would produce in him, some continuation of himself, amplified, enhanced, capable of survival and resistance. What the G-virus actually produced was something different. It consumed him, not immediately, not all at once. The process took time, and in the early stages there was still something of Birkin present in the thing that was transforming. Some residual awareness, some echo of intent, enough to pursue the UBCS team through the tunnels of the nest and retrieve the stolen samples by force, by terrible force, because what the G-virus produced was nothing if not capable of force. But as the mutation progressed, as the transformation moved through its stages, The William Birkin who had dedicated his life to this research receded further and further into the biological improvisation that the virus was making of his body. The intellect that had conceived the G virus, the love for his daughter, the complicated pride and grief of a man who had given everything to a work that was now consuming him. All of it subsumed, layer by layer, into something that retained Birkin's appearance in fragments, but had left his essential self behind. The UBCS soldiers he killed were not killed cleanly. They were killed by something that was not operating according to the logic of human violence, but according to something older and stranger and more terrible. And in dying, in being torn apart and infected by what Birkin had become, they did not simply die. The T-virus that was a standard element of Umbrella's security protocols, the baseline that every UBCS soldier carried in their bloodstream as a contingency, reacted with the G-virus exposure, and something else began to happen. In the chaos of the fight, in the tunnels and chambers of the nest, vials were broken. T-virus strains that had been maintained in the laboratory began to leak. The containment systems that should have prevented exactly this scenario were compromised in exactly the way that containment systems in places like this are always theoretically vulnerable to, which is through the failure of the human element, through violence and chaos and the total collapse of the careful protocols that function only as long as everyone involved behaves predictably. The T-virus entered the water supply. It entered the drainage systems. It moved from the deep underground into the city above with the quiet efficiency of something that has no agenda and no enemy and no ambition beyond the biological imperative to replicate. And in the body of William Birkin, former prodigy, former researcher, former husband, former father, something that no longer understood itself as any of those things moved through the lower levels of the nest, growing, changing, pursuing the singular imperative that the G virus had written over everything he had once been. The chain reaction had begun. Section 4, September 22nd. The chain reaction. The 7 days between September 22nd and September 29th, 1998, are among the most documented and least understood periods in the history of what the press would eventually call, with the numbing efficiency of headline language, the Raccoon City incident. Documented because Umbrella's internal systems and the various government agencies that were monitoring the situation from a careful distance generated an extraordinary volume of reports and assessments and classified communications during those 7 days. Least understood because the people who most needed to understand what was happening were almost without exception either dead or unable to communicate or operating without the information they would have needed to intervene effectively. The T-virus outbreak did not announce itself. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened in those 7 days. There was no moment, no single identifiable event at which the people of Raccoon City collectively recognized that they were in the middle of a viral apocalypse. What happened was a process, not an event. And like most processes, it was easy to misread in its early stages as something else entirely. The first reports that reached the RCPD and the Raccoon City emergency services were about unusual behavior, people acting strangely, aggressive incidents in the residential districts to the west of the city center, a part of town that happened to be closest to the areas of the water supply most immediately affected by the underground contamination. Calls about people attacking neighbors, about individuals who seemed disoriented, unresponsive, moving strangely. These reports were consistent, in their early form, with a public health incident of a conventional kind. A contamination event. A drug outbreak, perhaps. Methamphetamine and similar substances can produce exactly the kind of aggressive disorientation that the first reports described, and that was among the early explanations that circulated through the emergency response system before the scale of what was happening became impossible to explain through that lens. The RCPD responded. Officers were dispatched, paramedics were dispatched, and they encountered things that their training had not prepared them for, that their mental frameworks for what they might encounter in the line of duty had no category for, and that produced, in the first responders who survived their initial encounters, a specific kind of confusion that is distinct from ordinary shock. The confusion of a person whose fundamental model of the world has been violated in ways they haven't yet processed. The dead didn't stay dead. This was what it came down to, in its most basic form. The T virus reanimated recently deceased tissue, sustaining basic motor function and a kind of predatory tropism, an orientation toward the living, toward heat and movement and sound, while eliminating everything that constituted personhood. The people who died in those first encounters didn't stop moving, and the people who survived those encounters weren't always sure, in the chaotic conditions of the first responses, whether they had survived in the conventional sense. The infection spread through contact, through biting, primarily. The reanimated dead, operating on that predatory tropism, bit, and the T virus transmitted through saliva, and the people who were bitten experienced a progression of symptoms that moved from fever and disorientation through unconsciousness to death and reanimation at a rate that varied with the individual, but that, in the worst cases, could be measured in hours. The ERCPD began to lose contact with units. This was when Brian Irons, police chief, Umbrella asset, the man who had been paid to make certain that Umbrella's secrets stayed secret, made a decision that sealed the fate of the city. Or rather, he executed a decision that he had agreed to long before, under conditions that seemed hypothetical, and now were desperately actual. He restricted information. He managed communications. He did what he had been paid to do, which was to prevent the kind of organized, coordinated public response that might have opened channels through which Umbrella's involvement would become visible. He called in the RCPD's STARS unit, not because he needed them for the outbreak, but because they were getting too close to the truth about what was happening in the Arklay Mountains, where earlier Umbrella incidents had been unfolding. He wanted them in the building, where he could monitor them, where they couldn't do the kind of freelance investigation that had been making Umbrella nervous. Some of those STARS officers survived, some didn't, and the ones who survived left Raccoon City carrying knowledge that would eventually matter. Knowledge about Umbrella, about the research, about the architecture of the conspiracy that had built itself so comfortably into the civic structure of a city that had trusted it. But that is a different story. The STARS story belongs to a different chapter of this history, the chapter that runs through the mountains and the Spencer estate, and a different earlier nightmare. In the city, the 7 days were a cascade. It is worth trying to understand the experience of an ordinary Raccoon City resident during those 7 days, because the tendency in retrospect, the tendency when looking at a catastrophe of this scale, is to flatten the human texture of it, to let it become statistical, to process the 100,000 people as a number rather than as 100,000 individual lives navigating the specific, granular terror of those days. Most people heard things before they saw things. The early outbreak was in the western residential districts, and for people in other parts of the city, in the downtown, near the university, in the neighborhoods closer to the police station, the first awareness was secondhand. Rumors, stories from people who had cousins in the affected areas who had called before the phones started getting unreliable. News reports that were carefully calibrated by the city's emergency management officials, under Irons' influence, to describe a serious public health situation requiring limited evacuations, which was true in a narrow sense and catastrophically misleading in every broader sense. Some people left early. These were, statistically, the ones who survived, the ones who treated the incomplete official information as sufficient reason to pack a bag and get in a car and go somewhere else. The ones who said to their families, "I don't know exactly what's happening, but the fact that I don't know is itself reason enough to leave." These people tended to have certain things in common: a baseline skepticism about official reassurances or economic resources that made leaving possible, or a previous experience of some other emergency that had taught them that the official narrative in the early stages of a disaster is almost never the whole story. Most people stayed, because the official word was that it was contained, because leaving seemed like an overreaction, because the city was their home and their lives were there, and you do not abandon your home on the basis of a rumor unless the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence became overwhelming by around September 26th or 27th. By that point, the outbreak had spread significantly beyond the western residential districts. The hospital was full, and then more than full. The phones were increasingly unreliable. The smell, there is always, in accounts from survivors, a description of the smell, the particular combination of decay and copper and something organic and wrong that has no analog in ordinary urban life. The smell had become something that people noticed even in parts of the city not yet directly affected, carried on the wind in ways that the body registered as danger before the mind quite caught up. The military perimeter was established. This, too, was done quietly, officially framed as a precautionary containment measure for a public health emergency. The National Guard units that took up positions around the city's exits were presented in the limited official communications that continued to function as support for evacuation management. They were not there to manage evacuation. They were there to contain the situation, to prevent infected individuals from leaving the city limits, which was legitimate in the narrow epidemiological sense and devastating in the broader human sense, because it meant that uninfected people who were trying to escape were also being prevented from escaping. Raccoon City had become a sealed vessel. Inside that vessel, the city's institutional structures were failing in sequence. The hospital failed first, overwhelmed and then overrun. The RCPD, what was left of it, what had not been lost in those early response calls, retreated into the headquarters building, where the officers still alive attempted to hold a perimeter. The utilities began to fail in parts of the city as the human maintenance infrastructure that kept them running ceased to function. Power flickered and in some areas went out. Water pressure dropped. And in the middle of all this, in the subterranean nest laboratory below the industrial district, the Birkin situation continued to develop in ways that the remaining umbrella personnel in the facility were documenting with the particular grim efficiency of people who understand that what they're witnessing is historically extraordinary, even as it is personally catastrophic. The G-virus mutation in Birkin was progressing through what researchers would later, examining the documentation, describe as stages, though stage implies a linearity and discreteness that the actual biological process didn't quite have. Birkin was becoming something that had less and less continuity with William Birkin and more continuity with the G-virus's own biological agenda, growing larger, adding mass and structure in ways that defied normal skeletal and muscular constraints. Eyes appearing in unexpected locations on the body, a particularly disturbing detail that speaks to the G-virus's indifference to the ordinary geometry of living organisms. But there were moments, fragments of recognition, brief flickers of something that might have been memory or instinct or the last embers of love, when the Birkin thing moved with apparent purpose toward its daughter. Sherry. He was looking for Sherry. Whatever was left of William Birkin was oriented, among all the vast complexity of everything happening in and around the nest, toward his daughter. Whether this was protective impulse or predatory tropism is a question that the surviving documentation doesn't clearly answer. The answer may be that it was both, simultaneously, in the specific tragic way of a mind that is both present and absent, both itself and something irreparably other. Sherry was in the city. She would find her way into the ERCPD building, as children in crisis move toward whatever seems most structurally stable, toward the places where grown-ups are supposed to be. And she would carry something with her, a locket, a piece of jewelry that seemed ordinary, that contained in its small interior the only sample of the complete G-virus formula that existed outside the Birkin entity itself. She didn't know what she was carrying. She just knew it was her father's, and that the chain was thin and silver and had always seemed to her like a kind of talisman. It was everything. September 29th, a week after the chain reaction began. A tanker truck on a rain-slicked road. A young officer with a freshly pressed uniform and a young woman in a red jacket on a motorcycle, both of them just outside the edges of what had been a city and was now something else. The story was about to begin in earnest. Section 5, Leon S. Kennedy. The worst first day. Let us talk about who Leon Kennedy was, not just what he did. Because what he did in Raccoon City, the physical, documented, extraordinary things he survived and accomplished in the course of a single terrible night, those things are the skeleton of the story. But the flesh of it, the thing that makes it matter, is who he was before he arrived, and what arriving in that city cost him, and what it made of him afterward. Leon Kennedy grew up believing in things. This is not a small thing, and it is not a naive thing, though it is the kind of thing that sounds naive when you say it plainly. He believed in the social contract. He believed in institutions, in the idea that the systems of collective human organization, imperfect as they were oriented toward something real, toward protection and order, and the proposition that the strong owed something to the vulnerable. He believed in policing as a vocation, not merely a job, as a specific, valuable, difficult form of public service that required something more than the minimum. He had arrived at these beliefs through a combination of temperament and experience that he had never examined in much depth, because people rarely examine the foundations of their deepest convictions until those foundations are challenged. He was kind, in the specific way of people who are kind without thinking about it, instinctively, habitually, without wanting acknowledgement. He was earnest in a way that he had probably been teased about by people who had more distance from their own sincerity. He was, underneath the professional composure that he was still in the process of learning when he arrived in Raccoon City, genuinely and uncynically good. He was also 21, which meant he was good in that particular way of young people who have not yet had the experience of the world, systematically working against their goodness. He had not been badly let down yet. He had not encountered the specific kind of institutional corruption, the deliberate, sustained, structurally embedded corruption that makes a person recalibrate their entire understanding of what they're participating in when they put on a uniform. That recalibration was coming. It arrived essentially the moment he drove into Raccoon City and found that the city he was supposed to be reporting to was already in the process of consuming itself. The first hours were survival, which is its own form of education. Leon was a good shot. He had trained well, taken it seriously, understood marksmanship as a professional skill rather than a recreational hobby, and being a good shot kept him alive in the early passages of that night in ways that raw courage alone would not have. The reanimated dead required headshots to stop effectively, which was information Leon did not have going in and had to acquire empirically in the chaos of immediate life-or-death encounters, which is an extraordinarily unpleasant way to learn anything. He moved through the city with the direction that forward momentum provides in crisis situations, not because he had a clear plan, but because stopping meant death. And so, you keep moving and you process what you can as you move, and you file the rest away for later. He found his way to the RCPD, the building that should have been his workplace, the place he had been driving toward all night with that freshly pressed uniform and that particular first-day earnestness. It was nothing like what he had imagined. The grand facade was intact, the stone and the ornate architecture, but the building had been partially overrun. Officers were dead in the corridors, evidence of a sustained, losing battle against what had come in from outside. The systems that should have been functioning, communications, coordination, the chain of command, were broken. What Leon found in the RCPD was the aftermath of institutional failure in its most naked form. Not the theoretical failure, not the corruption that had enabled the outbreak. That was the upstream cause, invisible and abstract. What he found was the downstream consequence. Rooms full of dead colleagues, people who had come to work and done their best and been killed anyway because the conditions that should have allowed for an effective response had been systematically undermined. He also found survivors, a few, people in different corners of the building, isolated, holding on. And in finding those survivors, Leon discovered something about himself that would remain true in every crisis he faced afterward. He could not leave people behind. It was not a decision he made. It was a characteristic, like height or eye color, something constitutive rather than chosen. He was going to find everyone who was still alive, and he was going to get them out, or die trying. And the dying trying was a real and acknowledged possibility, not a figure of speech. He found files, documents. The administrative infrastructure of a police department continues to exist even when the department has been destroyed. And in those files, in those records and memos and correspondence, Leon found what any honest investigator would find when looking at the RCPD with the right questions in mind: the fingerprints of umbrella everywhere, the connections between the department and the corporation, the quiet ways in which the institution that should have been protecting the city had been doing something else. This was the beginning of Leon's recalibration. Not the dramatic, all-at-once revision that the narrative of disillusionment usually describes in retrospect, but the beginning of a quieter, more devastating process. The gradual recognition, piece by piece, that the system he had signed up to serve was not what he had believed it was, that the uniform he wore with such careful intention was part of a structure that had been used against the people it was supposed to protect. He kept moving anyway. This is important. The The recognition of institutional failure did not produce in Leon Kennedy the paralysis that it produces in some people. That specific, terrible paralysis of a person who has built their identity around a belief that has just been proven false. He processed it and kept moving, not because the information didn't matter, but because the immediate imperative of survival and rescue was more immediate than the longer process of understanding what it all meant. He moved through the building's wings, navigating the combination of umbrella security measures and the natural defensive architecture of a police station. The lockable doors, the evidence rooms, the interrogation areas. The building itself was a kind of puzzle, full of security measures that had been installed without any expectation that they would one day need to be navigated by a single officer trying to find a way through his own workplace. And then, in the middle of all this, in the middle of the blood and the overrun corridors and the documents and the survivors and the gradual accumulating weight of what he was learning about where he was and what had happened here, he encountered something that was completely different in kind from the reanimated dead he had been dealing with all night. It came from the outside, through a window or a wall. It didn't much matter which. What mattered was the size of it, an immense shape, humanoid but enlarged far beyond the human frame, wearing a long coat that had been designed for something other than its current wearer, moving with a focused, deliberate quality that was entirely unlike the shambling purposelessness of the ordinary infected. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't reacting to stimuli in the loose, disorganized way of the T-virus dead. It was looking for something specific. Leon, when he first encountered it, didn't know what it was looking for. He didn't know that it was a T-103 Tyrant, one of 6 that Umbrella had deployed from an aircraft into the dying city, specifically tasked with recovering the G-virus sample that the company had received. Intelligence was somewhere in the RCPD building. He didn't know about the Sherry connection, about the locket, about the extraordinary convergence of purposes that had brought both of them to this building on this night. What he knew was that it was coming for him, and that the things that had worked against the reanimated dead were not going to be sufficient. The Tyrant, which would come to be known, in the casual shorthand of the surviving accounts, as Mr. X, and this name has a quality that is almost too simple for the thing it names, too much like a comic book designation for something that moved through the building like a geological event, was something Umbrella had developed from the T-virus research as a military application, not a weapon in the traditional sense, more like a weapon as organism, a human host subjected to extreme T-virus modification and augmentation, pushed through a series of developmental procedures that had eliminated everything superfluous and intensified everything useful. What was left was enormous and nearly indestructible, and capable of following complex operational directives in ways that the ordinary infected could not, because what was left had enough cognitive function to pursue a goal across multiple environments and obstacles. Leon ran, and then Leon regrouped, and then Leon made the series of extremely deliberate, precise, courageous decisions that would define the pattern of the rest of the night. Identify what you can actually affect, apply maximum effort to those things, and maintain enough forward momentum to stay ahead of the things you can't stop directly. He was exceptionally good at this, better than most people would be, and better than he had any particular reason to be before that night, because nothing in his previous 21 years had specifically prepared him for what he was facing. He was adapting in real time, which is both the most human thing there is and, in conditions like these, the most heroic. But Leon was not alone that night. The figure he had briefly met and been separated from, Claire Redfield, was somewhere in the building, or near it, navigating her own impossible situation. And he was aware of her, in the way you become aware of the proximity of another conscious, surviving, trying person, in a context where most conscious, surviving, trying people have been eliminated. He was also not alone in another sense. A woman found him in the way that suggests she had been looking for him specifically, or at least for someone like him, someone who might be useful. She identified herself as Ada Wong. She said she was an FBI agent. She was looking for her partner, a man named John, who had been investigating Umbrella. Leon believed her, initially. He was 21. He was in a collapsing building full of the dead. He was encountering people one at a time in conditions of extreme stress, and the specific cognitive load of maintaining moment-to-moment survival left limited bandwidth for the kind of careful assessment that might have served him better with Ada Wong. Ada was not who she said she was. This will matter a great deal, but it will matter in ways that are complicated and nuanced and full of the particular moral ambiguity that makes Ada Wong one of the most interesting figures in this entire story, and she deserves her own space for that. For now, Leon and Ada move through the building together for a time, each helping the other in various ways. Leon, with his police training and his specific combination of courage and competence. Ada, with resources and knowledge that she had but didn't fully explain, navigating the building with a familiarity that Leon probably should have found more suspicious than he did. What Leon was building in those hours in the RCPD and the passages below it and the streets between was a kind of knowledge, an accumulative, experiential understanding of what had happened in Raccoon City and who was responsible and what it meant for every instinct he had brought with him when he drove toward this city with his freshly pressed uniform and his clear conviction that he was entering a life of public service. He was entering that life, just not the one he'd imagined, the one that was being constructed in him that night, experience by catastrophic experience, was harder and more complicated and far more necessary than anything he had conceived of when he was planning his route to Raccoon City and imagining what his first day on the job would be like. He thought about that, occasionally, in the brief moments between immediate crises, the version of himself that had woken up that morning and pressed that uniform, the version of himself that had still believed, with the full, uncomplicated weight of his conviction, in the system he was joining. That version wasn't wrong exactly, but he was becoming someone who understood that the belief had to be larger and harder and more self-aware than that you couldn't simply trust the system, that trusting required understanding, and understanding required being willing to see what the system actually was, which included its failures and its corruptions and its capacity for exactly what had been done to Raccoon City. He kept moving. He kept helping. He kept being exactly as competent and courageous as the situation required, even as the situation kept finding new ways to be worse than the previous situation. That was Leon Kennedy. That was who he was in those hours. Not a hero in the clean, uncomplicated sense, just a person who had decided, in the most fundamental terms available to him, that he was going to try. And trying in Raccoon City, in those last days of September 1998, was its own extraordinary act. Section 6, Claire Redfield. Looking for her brother, Claire Redfield arrived in Raccoon City looking for someone she loved. This is different from Leon's arrival, though both of them were young, and both of them were unprepared, and both of them found themselves navigating the same collapsing city. The difference is in the quality of the motivation. Leon came to fulfill a role, to step into a structure that he had chosen and prepared for. Claire came because her brother was missing, and she was going to find him. This matters. The emotional logic of Claire's story is fundamentally different from Leon's, and that difference shapes everything she does and every choice she makes across those terrible hours. She was 20 years old. She had grown up with Chris Redfield, older, solid, deeply dependable in that specific way of older brothers who take their responsibilities seriously. Chris had been her North Star in practical terms, the person she had oriented herself toward when she needed an example of how to move through a difficult world. He had taught her things, self-defense, how to handle a firearm, because Chris was a man who believed in preparedness, who had looked at the world and decided that the responsible thing to do was to be capable in as many circumstances as possible, how to fix things, mechanical things, how to stay calm when the instinct was to panic. She had internalized all of it, not reluctantly, not as a burden, but as the practical vocabulary of someone who had watched her brother and understood that capability was a form of care, that being able to take care of yourself was one of the most genuine ways of preventing the people who loved you from having to bear the weight of your incapacity. When Chris went dark, when the calls stopped and the letters went unanswered, and the few people she could reach who might know his whereabouts became evasive in ways that were specific enough to be alarming, Claire did not panic. She did what Chris had implicitly taught her to do. She moved. She gathered what information she could. She assessed. She acted. She drove to Raccoon City because that was where the trail led, because Umbrella was there, and whatever Chris had been investigating involved Umbrella and the mountains above the city. She wasn't going to wait for news to reach her. She was going to go and find it herself. The city she arrived in was not the city she expected. she had expected. Even knowing something was wrong, even with the gathering dread of the drive and the signs of disturbance she'd noticed in the last miles of her approach, something recognizable. A city in crisis still has a legibility to it. Emergency vehicles, visible authority, the familiar human infrastructure of organized response. What she found instead was the absence of all that, a city in a stage of dissolution where the ordinary markers of collective human function were absent or corrupted, where the streets had a quality that she had no previous experience to map it onto. She adapted quickly. This was the gift of her upbringing, the specific gift of having been taught that capability is the right response to difficulty, not reassurance seeking, not waiting for someone else to take charge, but moving and assessing and making the best decisions available with the information you have. She met Leon in those first chaotic minutes, the brief intersection of two lives that would diverge almost immediately and converge again much later. She recognized in him, in the instant of their meeting, the same quality she had been raised to value, the quality of someone who was going to try, who wasn't going to stop moving, who understood that forward was the only option, even when forward was terrifying. And then the tanker, and the explosion, and she was alone. Claire's path through the dying city was different from Leon's in ways that feel, in retrospect, almost thematically inevitable. Leon moved through the institutional spaces, the police department, the passages below. He engaged with the administrative, the documented, the evidence of what Umbrella had done to the civic structure of Raccoon City. His story was the story of an institution and its corruption. Claire's story was the story of a child. She found Sherry Birkin. This happened in the ERC RCPD building. Of course it did, because the building was the natural gathering point. The one structure in the dying city that still gestured toward safety and order, however compromised and limited that gesture had become. Sherry was hiding. 12 years old, moving through the corridors of the police building, with the specific kind of competent fear of a child who has learned early that the adult world is not reliably protective, who has developed her own resources because she couldn't always count on the resources of the people around her. Sherry was the daughter of William Birkin, but more immediately, in the terms of those hours, she was a child alone in a building that was being overrun, whose parents had both disappeared, who had been sent to the RCPD by her mother with instructions to find help, instructions that had the quality of a desperate improvisation by a woman who was not in a position to provide better options. Claire found her, and in finding her, everything changed. Not dramatically, not with the immediate recognition of fate or meaning. It changed in the immediate practical way of someone who has an orientation. Find my brother, move toward that. Suddenly acquiring a second, more urgent orientation, because a child was in danger, and the child was there, and that was sufficient. She didn't know about the locket, not at first. She didn't know what Sherry was carrying, what significance the small piece of jewelry around the girl's neck had for every organization currently interested in the contents of the RCPD building. She just knew that Sherry needed help, and she was capable of providing it, and that was, for Claire Redfield, genuinely enough. She became Sherry's protector. This is what it comes down to, in the simplest terms. In the hours that followed, Claire Redfield, 20 years old, alone in a dying city, having arrived looking for one person and found herself responsible for another, made every decision through the lens of getting Sherry out. Whatever she had to face, whatever she had to do, it was organized around the premise that this child was going to survive the night. This meant fighting. Claire was not a trained police officer. She had no institutional authority, no assigned weapon, no role in any of the systems that were supposed to be managing the situation. What she had was the practical capability that Chris had given her, the quick assessment that comes from having been taught to take things seriously, and a particular quality of determined attention that does not waver under pressure. She fought with what she found. She navigated with what she knew from navigating the building's challenges in the early hours. She was improvising, continuously, and she was good at it, but she was also learning. The same learning that Leon was doing in his part of the building, the accumulation of knowledge about what had happened here, who was responsible, how deep the corruption ran, what exactly the T virus was, and what exactly the G virus was, and why Sherry Birkin, the 12-year-old girl she was protecting, was more central to everything that had happened than any reasonable account of the situation should require a 12-year-old child to be. Because Sherry's centrality was its own kind of horror. She was the daughter of the man who had created the G virus. She was carrying the last known sample of the complete G virus formula in the locket around her neck. A locket her father had given her, without telling her what it contained. A final act of whatever complicated feeling drove Birkin in those last days. Guilt, perhaps, or protectiveness, or the kind of love that is so entangled with obsession that it can no longer reliably distinguish between the two, and she was being hunted. By the Birkin thing, which still moved with something like purpose toward her, toward his daughter, in the fragments of recognition that remained to it. By Umbrella's interests, which needed the G virus sample recovered. By the general chaos of the situation, which made every part of the building dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with any of the specific, organized threats. Claire didn't know all of this when she took Sherry under her protection. She found out progressively, piece by piece, as they moved together through the building and below it, and through the parts of the city they had to navigate to reach the nest. And each piece she found out made the protection she had already committed to more complicated and more costly, without making it less necessary. There is something deeply important about Claire's response to Sherry, something that goes beyond the heroic mechanics of it. Claire had come to Raccoon City looking for her brother. She had arrived because family meant everything to her, because the bond between her and Chris was among the most fundamental things in her life, the things she had organized herself around since they were children. And now she was in a situation where she had extended that same fundamental care to a child who had no claim on her beyond proximity and need. This is what love looks like when it is functioning well, not the contained, possessed version, mine alone, defined by the specific relationship, but the version that extends outward, that recognizes need as sufficient, that makes the decision to protect and then maintains that decision across every escalation and complication and terror that the night produces. Sherry sensed this. Children sense this. She didn't have the language for it. She was 12. She was frightened. She had been abandoned in the most absolute way by the collapse of the world around her. But she responded to Claire with the particular trust of a child recognizing that the adult in front of her is genuinely, functionally trustworthy. Not pretending, not managing, actually present, actually invested, actually going to try. They were good for each other. Claire's determination was amplified by Sherry's need and Sherry's resilience, and she was resilient in ways we'll talk about, was made possible by Claire's presence. Two people, radically different in age and circumstance, and the nature of their role in the events around them, sustaining each other through something that should, by any ordinary reckoning, have been unsurvivable. Claire also discovered something about the RCPD building itself in those hours. The police station, for all its grandeur and its history as a museum, concealed things. Passages that weren't on any publicly available floor plan, connections to the deeper infrastructure below the city, the fingerprints, everywhere, of Umbrella's integration into the civic structure, the ways in which the company's reach extended into the very architecture of the institution that was supposed to be keeping citizens safe. She found evidence of Irons, evidence of what he had done and what he had enabled and what he had been paid to overlook. This evidence was not satisfying, in the way that we sometimes imagine revelations to be satisfying, the truth coming to light, justice made possible. It was just devastating. One more layer of the thing that had been done to this city and its people. One more way in which the disaster was not simply a disaster, but the outcome of choices made by specific people who had known what they were doing. She thought about Chris. In the brief, involuntary way that the mind supplies your deepest concern, even when you're trying to focus on immediate demands. He was out there somewhere. Maybe he had answers she needed. Maybe he was part of the reason any of this had come to light at all. She knew, from the fragments of information she'd been able to gather, that the STARS investigations in the Arklay Mountains had been getting close to Umbrella's secrets, that Chris and his team had been the ones pushing at the edges of what the company had built its concealment around. She didn't know if he was alive. She had to proceed as if he was, because the alternative was not a thought she was going to allow herself in the middle of a night like this one. Forward, keep moving, keep Sherry safe, find the way out. That was Claire Redfield on the worst night of her life. Section 7. The Raccoon Police Department, a building full of secrets. The Raccoon Police Department headquarters deserves its own examination, not just as the setting for the night's events, but as a structure that embodied the entire history of what had gone wrong in Raccoon City. If you wanted to build a physical metaphor for institutional rot, for the ways in which the surface of something can be magnificent while the interior is compromised, you could not design anything more fitting than this building, grand and beautiful on the outside, full of bad death and secrets on the inside. It had been built in the early 20th century as a monument to civic aspiration. The people who designed it and funded it and opened it wanted Raccoon City to have something that declared the city's ambitions to the world, a public building that would not be mistaken for anything provisional or temporary, a building that said, "We are here and we intend to remain, and we take the life of this city seriously." The architecture was elaborate. Stone facades with carved details, large windows, a central hall that rose to a vaulted ceiling supported by pillars, staircases that swept up from the entrance with the kind of theatrical confidence that civic architecture of that era often possessed. For decades, it served as an art museum, and the collection it housed, regional works, some national acquisitions, sculpture and painting accumulated over the years through a combination of civic funding and private donation, gave the building a kind of cultural legitimacy that transcended its architectural ambitions. Raccoon City wasn't just a city with a beautiful building. It was a city that had thought seriously about what it wanted to put in that building and had decided the answer was art. The transition to police headquarters in the later decades of the 20th century was, from a certain angle, deeply strange. From another angle, it was entirely comprehensible. Cities adapt their institutions to the spaces they have, and the space was magnificent and already owned, and the RCPD needed a home that matched the scale of its ambitions. The art stayed because removing it would have been a kind of vandalism, a repudiation of what the building had been in favor of a purely functional understanding of what it now was. So, the building became both things simultaneously, a police department and a museum, functionality and beauty coexisting in the specific, slightly surreal way that improvised adaptations often create. The officers who worked there adapted, as people adapt to their environments. After a while, the painting in the corridor becomes wallpaper. The decorative stonework becomes background. You stop seeing what's extraordinary about where you are because the extraordinary has become your ordinary. And this is not a failure of appreciation, but simply how human attention works. But the building had another layer. Below the police functions, below the art collection, below the administrative and operational infrastructure of a working police department, there were spaces that were not on the official floor plans, that had not been officially sanctioned, that had been created or modified from existing infrastructure in the years of Umbrella's integration into Raccoon City's civic life. As the company's needs, its research needs, its logistical needs, its security needs, required connectivity between the surface world and the underground world it had built below. The nest was accessed from multiple surface points, and the RCPD building, given its central location and its deep umbrella connections through Bryan Irons, was one of them. Not through obvious passages or doors that would be immediately visible to anyone exploring the building, through the kind of concealment that requires architectural knowledge and deliberate design, passages that appeared to be utility access, corridors that dead-ended at what seemed like walls but weren't, connections to the sewage and drainage infrastructure below that provided routes to the deeper levels without requiring anything that would appear on a building survey. This hidden architecture was one of the things that made navigating the RCPD building that night so profoundly disorienting for both Leon and Claire. They were moving through a space that was simultaneously familiar in its function. It was a police station, it had the expected categories of rooms and uses, and strange in its specifics, full of unexpected obstacles and connections that didn't match the logic of the official structure. The security systems were another layer. Umbrella's involvement had added various security measures to the building over the years, some ostensibly for legitimate police use, and some for the company's specific purposes: key lock systems, hidden access mechanisms, puzzles, essentially. The building required navigation that went beyond simply finding the right door, and the design of those navigation challenges had a quality that suggested their creator wasn't thinking purely in terms of police department security. Irons had not installed these features himself, but he had permitted them, and that permission said everything necessary about where his primary loyalties lay. There was a room in the building, in the lower levels, below the main operational floors, that was particularly significant. A room that Irons had used for purposes that went far beyond his official function as chief of police. A room that Claire found in her navigation of the building's depths, and that told her, with a directness that could not be misread, something essential about the nature of Brian Irons. But we'll return to Irons. He has his own section, and he deserves the full weight of what that section will carry. The officers who had been in the building in the days before September 29th, the ones who had attempted to establish a perimeter, to hold the building as a refuge, to maintain some function in the face of what was happening in the city, left evidence of their fight everywhere. Notes, journals, the kinds of documents that people produce when they are trying to process an incomprehensible situation in writing, as if giving it language will give it containment. The notes of these officers are some of the most affecting documents that survive from the Raccoon City incident. Not because they describe extraordinary things, but because they describe extraordinary things in the ordinary voice of people who are trying to maintain their professional identity in circumstances that have made that identity almost meaningless. An officer named Marvin Branagh held a position in the building long after most of his colleagues were dead or missing, wounded, bitten, which was its own slow death sentence in the time and conditions of those days, but functional enough to maintain some presence in the building, enough to serve as a point of reference for the people who would come through that night. He had information. He had been there long enough to understand the building's systems better than most, to know where things were hidden and what the connections were between the police function and the umbrella-connected elements of the infrastructure. He told Leon what he could, in the compressed, essential communication of someone who doesn't have time for more, who is managing both the physical consequences of his injury and the specific weight of knowing that his survival is probably temporary. These moments, these brief human connections in the middle of a catastrophic night, these exchanges of information and care between people who have no shared history and no future together, are among the most quietly devastating elements of the entire story. The intimacy that crisis creates, the way that emergency strips the ordinary social distances between people and replaces them with something much more direct and much more honest, is both terrible and, in its own strange way, one of the more genuine forms of human connection available. Marvin knew he was dying. He knew what the bite meant. And he stayed in the building, doing what he could do until he couldn't anymore. Not because he didn't understand what was happening to him, but because there was still work that needed doing, and he was still capable of doing some portion of it. The building's condition worsened over the course of the night. Breaches in the perimeter that had been holding since the building's defensive status was established. The tyrant, Mr. X, moving through the structure with its terrible, purposeful quality, moving through walls and doors and anything else that stood between it and its objective, which made the building simultaneously more dangerous in the vertical sense, larger things forcing their way through floors and ceilings, and forced Leon and Claire into movements that were less about finding the optimal path and more about finding any path that wasn't currently occupied by something that would kill them. The art remained on the walls through most of it. This detail, trivial in one sense, in the context of everything else, has a particular quality in the surviving accounts. Officers fighting for their lives in corridors with oil paintings, blood on the floors beneath Renaissance-style portraits. The contrast between the building's aesthetic aspirations and its immediate, terrible reality created a kind of cognitive dissonance that survivors described as adding to the overall sense of unreality, the sense that the familiar categories of experience had been shuffled and no longer aligned in the ways they were supposed to. Below the main building, accessed through the passages and mechanisms that Umbrella had installed, was a set of deeper rooms and connections, a basement level that served as transition between the police functions above and the sewage and drainage systems that connected ultimately to the nest below. These lower levels were darker, more utilitarian, stripped of the architectural ambitions of the floors above. They smelled of water and concrete and something else, something organic and wrong. They were full of the specific kinds of obstacles that someone had installed with the explicit purpose of making unauthorized access difficult. Not the theatrical puzzles of the police building's security systems, but the grimmer, more practical obstacles of an industrial facility trying to protect something valuable. Leon and Claire both passed through these lower levels in their respective navigations of the night, both of them moving downward toward the same eventual destination, the nest, the laboratory, the final confrontation with what Umbrella had built below the city, by different routes, at different times, carrying different knowledge and different responsibilities, but oriented toward the same endpoint. The building had been, in its time, a source of civic pride, a symbol. The people of Raccoon City had looked at it with something, not grandeur exactly, because the American Midwest has always been somewhat suspicious of grandeur, but something like satisfaction. This is ours. This is a sign of who we are and what we've built. What it had become by the night of September 29th was a testament to what happens when the institutions that are supposed to serve the public are hollowed out, when they maintain their external form while losing their essential purpose. The building was still magnificent. The stone was still carved. The central hall still had its soaring ceiling and its pillars and its art. But the people who were supposed to be in it, doing the work that it existed to support, were almost all dead. And the work that had actually been going on in its hidden lower levels, the work that Irons had permitted and enabled and been paid to ignore, was a betrayal of everything the building had been designed to represent. It was, in this sense, the most honest building in Raccoon City. It showed, with complete and terrible clarity, exactly what the city had actually been. Section 8. Ada Wong, the woman nobody could read. Ada Wong is difficult to describe because describing her accurately requires holding several things in tension that don't naturally coexist. She was deceptive and she was genuine. She was ruthless and she was, at certain moments, moved by something that looked remarkably like care. She pursued an agenda that had nothing to do with the welfare of the people around her, and she occasionally made decisions that compromised that agenda in ways that only make sense if you account for something, call it feeling, though she would probably resent the word, that her professional identity had no official room for. She arrived in Raccoon City with a cover identity and a mission that were both more and less than they appeared to be. The cover identity, FBI Special Agent, assigned to investigate Umbrella, looking for a colleague named John, was false in its specifics and true in certain of its implications. She was investigating Umbrella. The organization she actually worked for, which was never officially named in any of the documentation from that period, had interests in Umbrella's research that were not benevolent. They were competitive, acquisitive interests. The interests of a group that understood exactly what the G virus represented and wanted it for reasons that were not dissimilar from the reasons Umbrella had developed it. She was exceptionally skilled. This is the baseline from which everything else must be understood. Whatever complications and ambiguities attend Ada's story, whatever the moral calculus of her choices, the foundational fact is that she was operating at an extraordinarily high level in conditions that were, objectively, extremely difficult. She navigated the dying city with a competence that exceeded the situational preparation of almost anyone else in the building that night. She gathered information efficiently and protected it effectively. She made quick assessments about risk and benefit and the likely behavior of the various actors in her environment. She was, in the cold professional sense, excellent at what she did. What she did, on the most immediate level, was find Leon Kennedy and cultivate a working relationship with him under false pretenses. This relationship served her mission. Leon was a capable physical asset in a dangerous environment. He had legitimate police credentials that opened certain spaces and narratives. And he was, critically, the kind of genuinely well-intentioned person who would extend trust and protection to someone in apparent need. Ada recognized this quality in Leon immediately and made a calculated decision to use it. This is where the complexity begins. Because something happened in the hours they spent together, moving through the building, sharing information, facing things that required genuine mutual dependence, that Ada had not accounted for in her professional calculus. Leon was not simply useful. He was present and honest and good in ways that her professional environment had not regularly provided her with. And the contrast between his genuine openness and the elaborate performance she was maintaining created a kind of friction in her that she had not anticipated. The specific contours of what Ada felt during those hours, and what she would carry forward from them into the years after, are not fully accessible in the surviving documentation, because Ada, by definition, does not produce transparent first-person accounts of her internal states. What we have are actions, Choices. Moments in which the professional calculation would have dictated one behavior and the actual behavior was different. She saved his life, more than once. Not as professional strategy. There were moments when the professional calculation would have suggested leaving the situation, cutting losses, completing the retrieval mission without the complications that protecting Leon imposed. She didn't. She made the harder choice, the choice that served him at some cost to herself. And the pattern of those choices over the course of that night is its own kind of testimony. She was looking for the G virus. More specifically, she was looking for a research file, detailed documentation of the G virus formula that could be transmitted to her employers and used to develop their own version. The physical sample was secondary. What her organization wanted was the information, the years of research that Birkin had documented, the formula that would allow someone with the right resources to replicate what had been created in the nest below Raccoon City. This mission was in direct tension with everything that needed to happen to get Leon and the survivors out of the building, and yet Ada managed for most of the night to pursue both. She was threading an extraordinarily difficult needle, maintaining the cover identity and the mission parameters while extending genuine aid to the people around her, and she was doing it with a facility that suggested years of practice at exactly this kind of moral compartmentalization. Then something changed. She was shot. The specifics, who shot her, in what context, the exact circumstances, are part of the night's chaos, the way events in extreme conditions compress and distort in the surviving accounts. What matters is that she was badly wounded, and that the wound came at a moment that made the continuation of her mission effectively impossible, and that in the vulnerability of that moment, with Leon present and genuinely distressed by what had happened to her, the compartmentalization that had been maintaining the separation between the mission and everything else collapsed somewhat. What passed between them in that moment has been interpreted in various ways by various people attempting to reconstruct the night's events. What seems clear is that Ada, in her most vulnerable state, was something different from the professional instrument she had maintained herself as being throughout the preceding hours. More present, more honest, in whatever truncated, partial way honesty was possible for her. Moved, and she was moved, whatever she would say about it, by Leon's response to her situation, by the specific quality of his distress, by the fact that his concern for her was entirely real and entirely without agenda. She passed the retrieval mission to him, in a sense, gave him information that would allow him to continue toward the nest and what waited there, and she disappeared from his immediate narrative, or appeared to, at a moment that her employer would have assessed as mission failure. It was not mission failure. Ada was still in the building, still functioning, still pursuing her objectives, through means and by routes that weren't apparent in the moment. Her survival was real. She was more capable than her injury suggested she was, or perhaps the injury was less severe than it appeared, or perhaps she was simply that extraordinary at maintaining function under conditions that would incapacitate other people. The G virus sample reached her. By the end of the night, she had what she had come for, by methods that involved a combination of skill and timing and the exploitation of circumstances that she had neither created nor fully controlled. The mission was, in the strictest terms, accomplished. But Ada left Raccoon City carrying more than the research data. She carried something that had no place in her professional ledger, no category in the cost-benefit analysis that her work required. An awareness of Leon Kennedy that was more than professional inventory, a consciousness of what genuine care looked like, extended toward her by someone who owed her nothing and had every reason to suspect her and chose not to. The specific quality of that, in her experience, was rare enough to register. Years later, in the various subsequent events that would bring Ada back into contact with the Raccoon City story, and with Leon specifically, the choices she made would continue to show that pattern, the mission, and then the deviation from the mission, and then the mission again, but carrying the deviation, carrying the weight of the choice that had been made in the dying city, in the corridors of the ruined police building, when she had been wounded and Leon had been genuinely worried, and something between them had been, briefly, unguarded and real. Ada Wong is not a hero. She was working for an organization with interests that were dangerous and not benevolent, pursuing a goal that, if achieved, would extend the existence of the G virus research into another institutional context where it could cause more harm. She was deceptive by profession and by habit, and the deceptions she practiced in Raccoon City had real costs for the people around her. But she is not simply a villain either. She is something more interesting and more human than that. A person operating in a moral environment that had taught her to keep everything at arm's length, who found, in one specific and unrepeatable set of circumstances, that arm's length was insufficient, that some things got through, that some people, by the quality of their presence and their care, and their absolute refusal to stop treating you as a full human being, even when you've given them every reason to stop, find their way past the professional distance and become something that remains with you. She would never say any of this, but her actions, read over time, say it for her. Section 9, Brian Irons. The man who let the city burn. Brian Irons had been the chief of the Raccoon City Police Department for years before the outbreak. He had cultivated the image of a serious, experienced law enforcement professional, dedicated to order, demanding of his subordinates, the kind of authority figure who could be difficult to work for, and who inspired both respect and fear in roughly equal measure. His record, publicly, was clean. No major scandals, no documented malfeasance. The kind of institutional career that looks, from the outside, like competence maintained over time. The inside was something entirely different. Irons had a relationship with the Birkin family, with William Birkin specifically, that predated the RCPD and the outbreak by years. Birkin had identified him early as a useful asset, a man in a position of institutional authority who had ambitions that exceeded his ethical constraints and financial resources that didn't match those ambitions. The combination of ego and need and a certain particular blindness to the consequences of his choices made Irons exactly the kind of person that Umbrella had always been good at identifying and cultivating. The bribery was gradual. This is almost always how it works. Not a single dramatic offer that requires a single dramatic decision, but a series of smaller steps, each one building on the last, each one making the next step easier, because the previous compromises have already been made. Irons received things, access to resources, money that appeared in ways that were deniable, support for certain career moves that might otherwise have required more legitimate qualification. In exchange, he performed services that went progressively deeper into genuine criminality, information that was suppressed, investigations that were misdirected, personnel decisions that served Umbrella's interests rather than the department's. By 1998, he was deep in. Too deep to exit even if he had wanted to, which is the classic architecture of corruption. The early compromises create the leverage that makes subsequent compliance necessary, and eventually the person is maintained not primarily by the benefits they're receiving, but by their knowledge that exiting would expose what they have already done. But Irons was also, and this is important, genuinely unwell, not in a way that exculpates his choices. The law and basic moral accounting don't work that way, and the fact of mental illness is not the same thing as the absence of moral agency, but in a way that adds a layer to the picture, makes it more complex and more terrible than simple corruption for profit would be. Irons had a history of violent ideation. He had impulses that his position had given him the power to suppress from consequence, and the possession of that power, the knowledge that certain things he might do could be covered up, could be explained away, could be protected, had enabled those impulses in ways that simple opportunity usually does enable simple corruption. The orphanage. Raccoon City had an orphanage. Of course it did. Medium-sized American cities in the 1990s typically had some version of this institutional infrastructure for children without family support. The orphanage was a civic function, officially managed through the city's social services system, but with the connection to Umbrella's interests that characterize so many of Raccoon City's civic functions. Children from the orphanage had been subjects, over the years, of certain Umbrella research programs, not with their knowledge or consent, not with the oversight of any ethical body. In the specific fashion of Umbrella's approach to human subjects research throughout its history, the children were used because they were available, and because the people responsible for their welfare had been compromised. Irons was complicit in this, more than complicit. He was the mechanism by which the connection between the orphanage and Umbrella's research was protected from the kind of scrutiny that might have exposed it. He used his position to ensure that questions were not asked, that investigations were not opened, that the welfare of those children was subordinated to the interests of the company that was paying him. This is the deepest level of what Irons did and what he was. Not simply a corrupt police chief who had been bribed into maintaining a convenient blindness. a man who had actively, consciously traded the protection of children for his own advancement and the preservation of his own position. Children who had no advocates and no alternatives, who had been placed in the care of a civic institution that had been thoroughly compromised by the time they arrived in it. When the outbreak came, when September 22nd passed and the city began its death spiral, Irons did not attempt to help. He could have. At key moments in those 7 days, he was in a position to take actions that would have allowed more people to escape, to increase the odds that the information about Umbrella's responsibility would reach people who could act on it. He didn't. He managed the situation in ways that served the goals he had been paid to serve, which were containment, not of the virus, but of the information, making certain that Umbrella's role remained unclear, that the chain of causation could be obscured, that the corporate liability that should have followed from what had happened in the nest would not be attached to the people who had built it and run it. He retreated to the Erie RCPD building. But even there, in the building that was supposed to be his command post in an emergency, Irons was not serving the people who were with him. He was serving something else. He was maintaining access to Umbrella's connections in the building. He was managing his own survival in ways that were entirely disconnected from any responsibility to the officers still alive and the civilians who had come to the building for safety. Claire found him. This encounter, Claire Redfield, 20 years old, looking for a way through the building with Sherry Birkin in her care, finding the chief of police, had a quality that was almost farcical in the grotesque way that the worst revelations sometimes are. The man in the chief's office, in the building full of dead officers, was not what his title suggested. He was not a resource or an authority or even a functional adult. He was a man in an advanced state of psychological decomposition, maintaining the external forms of his role, while the substance of it had long since been abandoned. He had the body of the mayor's daughter. He had been doing things with it, things that speak to the violent impulses that his position had enabled, and that the total collapse of normal social constraint had released in their most unmediated form. Claire encountered evidence of this, and it told her, with a clarity that no amount of institutional documentation could have matched, exactly what kind of man Brian Irons was, and what exactly the corruption of this city's protective structures had meant in human terms. He died in the building. The specific circumstances of his death, the G-virus, the Birkin thing, the terrible logic of a monster finding the man who had served its creator's institutional interests, have a quality of dark justice that does not really satisfy, because the concept of justice requires that the right people know what happened and draw the right conclusions and make the right changes, and none of those things happened in the way that would make the word satisfying. Irons died. The orphanage children he had traded remained in their history, unnamed and unacknowledged in the official accounting. The corruption he had maintained remained embedded in the city's DNA until the city itself was destroyed, and even after, in the people who had benefited from it and scattered before the outbreak, who carried the institutional culture of Raccoon City with them into whatever came next. What Brian Irons represents is not unique to this story. He represents the particular kind of institutional failure that is most dangerous not because it is spectacular, but because it is mundane. The corrupt administrator, the public official who has quietly decided that his personal interests are the only interests worth protecting. The man in a position of power over vulnerable people who has chosen, repeatedly and with full awareness, to betray them. Every institution has its irons, not always this extreme, not always with these specific consequences. But the type, the person inside the structure who has traded its actual function for personal advancement, who has learned to wear the costume of legitimacy while serving entirely different interests, this type is not exceptional. It is disturbingly common. And the Raccoon City disaster is, in part, the story of what happens when enough people like Irons are in enough positions of enough institutional power. The structure that should have protected people becomes instead the mechanism of their destruction. Section 10. Sherry Birkin. The child caught between worlds. There are several ways to tell the story of Sherry Birkin, and none of them are easy. You can tell it as the story of a child who was failed by the adults responsible for her, who grew up in the specific neglect of parents too, consumed by their work to be fully present, who was sent into a crisis she could not have prepared for by a mother who had run out of better options. That story is true, and it matters. You can tell it as the story of a child who demonstrated extraordinary resilience, who navigated a dying city at 12 years old with resources that were not adequately provided to her, who survived things that most adults would not have survived, who made it through the night because she had built, in the quiet of her isolated childhood, an internal architecture that was stronger than the circumstances of her life had required her to need until now. That story is also true, and it matters. Or you can tell it as the story of a child who was, without her knowledge or consent, the object of events far larger than herself, who was carrying something in a locket around her neck that made her the unwitting center of multiple competing agendas, whose biological relationship to the man who had created the G-virus made her body itself a kind of contested territory. That story is perhaps the most difficult and the most important. Sherry was 12. Let that age sit for a moment and be fully real. 12 is not an age that comes with the resources to process catastrophe at this scale. It is an age that comes with school and friends and the ordinary concerns of early adolescence and whatever family life has shaped it. For Sherry, that family life had been shaped by two brilliant, consumed, difficult parents. Parents who were in many ways good people in the private sense, while being complicit in institutional structures that were deeply harmful. They loved her. This seems clear from the fragments of documentation that survive, the attention they paid to her when they paid attention, the specific ways in which the Birkenthing's movements through the nest appeared oriented toward her in those fragments of remaining recognition. They just weren't there. Not in the day-to-day sense that a child needs. They were in the laboratory. They were in the work. And Sherry had learned, as children learn these things, to not require what was not available, to build the internal life that substituted for the external warmth that wasn't consistently offered. She had the locket. Her father had given it to her, and she wore it because it was his, and he was absent, and the locket was a form of closeness in his absence. She didn't know what it contained, the full G-virus formula, the distillation of decades of research, the thing that every faction with an interest in the events of Raccoon City wanted to acquire. She just knew it was his. That was sufficient reason to keep it close. When her mother sent her to the PD building with the instruction to find help, Sherry moved through the dying city with the particular combination of competence and terror that had become her only available mode. The city she walked through was nothing like the city she had grown up in. Same streets, same architecture, entirely alien in its condition, in the things that were moving through it and the things that were no longer there. She navigated on instinct and on the practical intelligence that loneliness had developed in her. She found her way to the RCPD, and she found Claire. The relief of finding Claire, of encountering an adult who was genuinely, functionally present, who extended care without condition or agenda, who made it immediately clear that Sherry's survival was now her priority. This relief cannot be overstated. Sherry had been moving through a catastrophe entirely alone, with no one responsible for her, with the specific weight of being 12 in a situation that had stripped away every protective structure she had grown up taking for granted. Finding Claire was the first moment in hours that felt like something other than pure, unmediated survival. She trusted Claire completely. This was not naivety. Sherry was perceptive. She had grown up reading adults carefully. She had the specific intelligence of children who learn early that adult intentions are worth assessing. The trust she extended to Claire was based on something real and recognizable. The quality of Claire's presence, the way she moved and spoke and made decisions, the way she kept Sherry in her field of awareness without making Sherry feel like a burden. It was genuine. Sherry was old enough and sharp enough to know the difference between genuine and performed. They moved through the building together, and then through what was below the building, and then further toward the nest, toward the endpoint that the various forces converging on that night had been moving toward since September 22nd. Sherry was infected. This happened in the nest. Her father found her, in the way that the Birkenthing found people, and in finding her implanted the G-virus embryo. The G-virus implantation was not simply infection in the way the T-virus operated. The G-virus attempted to rewrite the host from the inside, to produce another G-mutant, another stage of the transformation that Birkin was continuously undergoing. The implantation was simultaneous with the remnants of recognition. Whatever was left of William Birkin still oriented toward his daughter, still moving toward her through the biological logic of a virus that connected them now in the most terrible way imaginable. Claire fought for Sherry. found the devil vaccine in the nest's records and systems, a counteragent specifically designed for G-virus exposure, developed as a contingency measure by the nest researchers who had understood, at some level, that working with the G-virus required preparing for the possibility of accidental exposure. The vaccine existed because scientists had been careful enough to prepare for an accident. She administered it, and Sherry survived. This survival was not straightforward. The G-virus had already begun its work in Sherry's cells, and the vaccine interrupted that process at a stage where it had already made certain changes. Sherry emerged from the experience still fundamentally herself, still 12, still sharp, still the person who had navigated the nest and the dying city with whatever internal resources she had brought to it, but changed. The cellular changes that the G-virus had initiated before the vaccine arrested its progress left her with something that the medical personnel who examined her afterward would spend years attempting to fully characterize: an accelerated regenerative capacity. Wounds healed faster than they should. Physical recovery from illness and injury followed a different timeline than expected. She was not a mutant. She was not a monster. She was a 12-year-old girl who had survived the worst night in the history of Raccoon City and was going to carry the marks of it, physical and otherwise, for the rest of her life. The afterwards matters, for Sherry, in ways it doesn't always receive enough attention. Claire survived. Leon survived. They carried their experiences from Raccoon City into subsequent chapters of their lives that, while dangerous and difficult, were at least lives they chose to live. Adults navigating a world that they had some agency in shaping. Sherry was 12. And after the night was over, after the nest and the train and the explosion and the escape, she did not simply return to some previous normality. There was no previous normality to return to. Her father was dead, or whatever the word is for what happened to William Birkin. The question of whether the end of the Birkin thing constituted the death of William Birkin being one of those questions that doesn't have a clean answer. Her mother was gone. The city she had grown up in was about to be destroyed. She was taken in by the government, by people whose interest in her was not purely humanitarian. She was the daughter of the G-virus's creator. She had been exposed to and survived G-virus infection. She was a research subject of some significance to various interested parties. This is perhaps the most damning detail of the aftermath. The detail that most clearly demonstrates the continuity between what Umbrella had done and what the government agencies that stepped into Umbrella's absence would do. They were interested in Sherry Birkin primarily as a biological and informational asset. She grew up in that context, under observation, under care that was genuine in some ways and extractive in others. She grew up smart and capable and careful and carrying the specific knowledge that comes from having been, at 12 years old, the center of something that destroyed an entire city. She became a government operative, an agent with exactly the qualities you would expect from someone with her background: technically excellent, practically capable, extremely difficult to surprise, and possessed of a very clear-eyed understanding of institutional interests that was the product of years spent being managed by institutional interests. She worked for Leon eventually, or with Leon, in the specific, complicated adult relationship of two people who share an extraordinary history and have both, in their different ways, built their adult lives around managing the consequences of it. She was fine, or as fine means in these circumstances. She had built a life that was meaningful and competent and genuinely hers, out of the materials that an extraordinary catastrophe had left her with. But she was also always going to be the girl in the nest, the 12-year-old with the locket, the child whose father had used her as a repository for his most dangerous work, without telling her what he'd done, who had had the G-virus injected into her by the mutated remnant of that same father, who had survived all of it by grace and by Claire Redfield, and by the devil vaccine that someone had had the foresight to create. She survived, and survival, in stories like this one, is not the end of the story. It is just the end of this particular chapter of it. Section 11, Into the Dark. The Nest Laboratory. Everything in the story of Raccoon City, every thread we have followed, Leon's night in the dying city, Claire's protection of Sherry, Ada's mission, the fall of the RCPD, the transformation of William Birkin, all of it converges eventually on the nest. This is where it began, in the strictest causal sense. The G virus was here. The UBCS raid that shot Birkin and triggered the chain reaction happened here. The T virus entered the water supply from here. And it is here, in the deep limestone below Raccoon City's industrial district, that the final confrontations of the night played out. In the corridors and research wings and power systems of a facility that was never supposed to be found by anyone who wasn't supposed to find it. The nest is worth describing carefully because it is not simply a setting. It is a record, a physical testament to what Umbrella actually was. Not the public-facing pharmaceutical company, not the civic benefactor, not the employer and the sponsor of university research programs, but the thing underneath all of that. The thing that had always been the actual purpose of the whole enormous edifice. You reach it from below, through passages that connect to the sewage infrastructure of the city above, through transitions from the utilitarian darkness of the drainage systems into the deliberately engineered environment of the facility itself. The nest was built to feel like somewhere, not like a temporary installation or a bunker improvised from existing space. It was designed with the intention that people would work there for extended periods, that it would function as a genuine research environment rather than simply a secure location. There are laboratories that look like laboratories, actual research spaces with actual equipment, the specific material culture of biological research, centrifuges and incubators, and the organized chaos of active scientific work, the whiteboards with equations and diagrams, the personal effects that researchers leave at their workstations because they spend enough time there to personalize the space. It was full of the dead, not everywhere, not all at once. The outbreak that had begun on September 22nd had reached the nest through various pathways. The same pathways that had connected the laboratory to the city above now worked in reverse, bringing the consequence of what had been created down into the place that created it. The researchers who had been in the facility when the T virus entered the water supply had been exposed and had died, and had become what T virus exposure produces. The security personnel who had been stationed there had encountered the Birkin thing in its progressive stages and had fared accordingly. What was left, by the time Leon and Claire separately made their way into the nest on September 29th, was the aftermath of an extraordinary catastrophe that had played out in miniature, as if the whole tragedy of the city above had been rehearsed first in the confined space of the laboratory below. The same categories of horror, the reanimated dead, the mutated creatures produced by extended viral exposure, the evidence of rapid institutional collapse as the people who were supposed to be managing the crisis lost the capacity to manage it, were present in the nest with a concentrated intensity because the facility was full of researchers who had been closer to the source than anyone, and moving through all of it, the Birkin thing, through stages of mutation that had been progressing continuously since September 22nd, further and further from anything that retained the shape of William Birkin, larger, stranger, more terrible, still oriented toward the sample, and toward Sherry, and toward some residual imperative that the G virus had imposed on what was left of him. The nest's records were extraordinarily comprehensive. The culture Umbrella had built in its research facilities, for all its ethical horrors, was a culture of meticulous documentation. Everything was recorded. Experimental protocols, results, deviations from expected outcomes, the notes of individual researchers, written in the specific shorthand of people who have spent years developing a shared technical vocabulary, the administrative records of the facility, staffing, scheduling, procurement, security logs. These records told the whole story. Not in the narrative sense, they were data, technical records, the raw material from which a narrative could be constructed, but in the comprehensive sense. If you had access to the nest's archives and the time and the expertise to read them, you would understand, completely and without ambiguity, what Umbrella had been doing below Raccoon City for the years that the nest had been operational, what the T virus was, what the G virus was, how the September 22nd incident had occurred, what the connection was between the research below and the catastrophe above. Ada found some of this. It was, in part, what she had come for. Not the technical data exclusively. She had specific parameters, specific research files that her employer wanted, but she navigated the nest with a facility that suggested prior knowledge of its systems, either through intelligence acquired before her deployment or through the specific kind of rapid environmental assessment that she was extraordinarily good at. Leon found some of this too, in a different way, not as intelligence gathering, but as the investigative process of someone who is trying to understand, in real time, the full picture of what he has been moving through all night. He was a police officer, or he was trying to be. And the police instinct, the instinct to understand the situation fully, to follow the evidence to where it leads, to not be satisfied with the partial picture, that instinct drove him through the nest's records, even as the immediate survival demands of the environment competed for his attention. Claire was in the nest with Sherry, and it was here that the Birkin encounter happened. The direct confrontation that the whole night had been building toward, father and daughter in the biological context of the father's creation. The emotional register of this encounter, for Claire, was one of the most difficult passages of the night. Protecting someone from the thing that used to be their parent, the thing that is still oriented toward them in some terrible residual way, requires a specific kind of compartmentalization that is different from ordinary combat, requires being clear-eyed about what is in front of you, while being aware of what it once was and what it meant to the person beside you. She managed it, because she had to, because Sherry was there, and the alternative to managing it was not acceptable, the devil vaccine. Finding it in the nest required navigating the facility's research archives, knowing what to look for, which meant knowing that the implantation had happened, which meant understanding what the G virus did, and what the existing countermeasures were. Claire worked through this with the focused efficiency of someone who understands that time is the primary constraint, and thoroughness is secondary to speed. She found it. She administered it. Sherry survived. Below the main research levels of the nest, below even the areas where the active research had been conducted, there was another level, the level where the waste products of Umbrella's research had been disposed of, not carefully, not in compliance with any standard that would have been recognized by a legitimate regulatory body. The dumping ground, essentially, for the biological consequences of decades of viral research, modified organisms, experimental failures. The things that had been created and had not been what the research protocol required, and that therefore needed to be disposed of. Some of them had survived disposal, in the specific ironic way of things that are the products of virus research, resistant to the mechanisms of their own elimination. What lived in those lowest levels of the nest was something that existed outside any of the organized research programs, outside any intentional design. It was the emergent product of decades of unregulated biological waste, the accumulation of partially transformed organisms in a shared space, the evolutionary consequences of viral interactions that hadn't been planned but had happened anyway. It was enormous and ancient and had been in the dark long enough to develop adaptations to the specific environment of the facility's lowest reaches. Neither Leon nor Claire encountered this directly in the main arc of the night. Others who moved through those levels in different parts of the timeline were less fortunate. The Nestie's power systems were failing. This had been happening progressively since September 22nd, as the staff who maintained them were lost and the automated systems ran without human oversight for longer than they had been designed to run. The environmental controls that kept the research areas at the precise temperatures and humidity levels required for the experiments were faltering. The security systems, the various automated defenses that the facility used to maintain containment and restrict access, were increasingly operating on degraded parameters, triggering or failing to trigger in ways that were unpredictable. This made the nest, in the later hours of September 29th, even more dangerous than it had been in the early parts of the night. The environment was actively working against survival in ways that went beyond the biological threats. The facility itself was becoming unreliable, unpredictable, a physical context that could no longer be trusted to behave in any consistent way. And the self-destruct sequence? Every facility like this had one. Every Umbrella research installation had protocols for catastrophic containment failure, protocols that were designed to eliminate the research and the physical facility rather than allow a breach. The nest was no exception. The sequence could be triggered manually, and it had been triggered. By whom exactly is a question that the documentation doesn't answer clearly, but the result was unambiguous. A countdown, running against everything else happening in the nest, toward the elimination of the entire facility and everything in it, including the people still in it. This created the final urgency that drove the last portion of the night. Not just escape from the biological threats and the Birkin thing and the failing environmental systems, but escape from the facility itself, from the physical structure that was preparing to eliminate its own existence. The nest had a train, a private line running from the facility through the rock to an exit point outside the city, or beyond the perimeter of what had become the combat zone around Raccoon City. A last egress route designed for exactly the kind of emergency that Umbrella had always known might eventually occur. The last train out. Getting to it required navigating the full horror of the nest in its final hours, everything that the facility had produced and everything it had become in the days since September 22nd, with the countdown running and the knowledge that the train was the only way out, and the train would not wait. Leon made it. Claire made it with Sherry. They found each other in those final moments, briefly reunited on the platform as the nest's destruction approached. Two young people who had started the night as strangers and had traveled separate routes through the same catastrophe and were now, briefly, in the same moment again, with the same desperate need to move and the same knowledge of what the night had cost. The Birkin thing found the train. Of course it did. The G-virus drove it toward the sample, toward Sherry, toward whatever remained of William Birkin's paternal orientation, and the train was where those things were. What the confrontation on the train looked like, what the final stages of the Birkin mutation produced, is perhaps the most difficult part of the night to put into words. Not because the physical description is complicated, but because the emotional register of it is so layered. This was a person, a scientist, a father, a man who had done extraordinary things and terrible things and had been capable of love and had failed at love in specific, consistent, deeply human ways, and whatever was on that train was the end of all of that. Was the absolute termination of William Birkin as a human being, everything compressed into a biological imperative that had no room for any of the things he had once been. They stopped it. They had to. And they did. The train moved. The nest burned. The timer hit 0. Section 12, the last train out, aftermath and legacy. The train moved through the dark, underground, through the passages that Umbrella had built to connect the nest to the world outside the city, carrying 3 survivors, 2 young people who had been strangers 14 hours ago, and a 12-year-old girl who had been carrying a secret she didn't know about, through the rock and the dark, towards something that might possibly be an exit. Leon and Claire and Sherry on a train in the dark, not speaking, in the immediate aftermath, not yet. There are moments after crisis where the body simply insists on existing, on the basic mechanics of breathing and continuing to be present, before it has the resources to compose itself into words or communication or anything more complex than the fact of survival. They had made it. The nest was gone, destroyed in the explosion that the facility's own self-destruct sequence had produced, the limestone closing over what had been, for years, the most sophisticated and the most terrible biological research facility in the world. 40 meters below the city, the evidence of what Umbrella had built was being turned to rubble and fire. The research records, the accumulated documentation of decades of viral development, of the T-virus and the G-virus and the human subjects who had contributed involuntarily to their development, were burning with everything else. Some of it had already been taken. Ada had taken it. The file, the data, the retrieval mission's target, it was gone from the nest before the explosion, in the hands of someone who worked for people who had their own plans for it. This fact, which would become clear in the days and weeks after the immediate crisis, was one of the more quietly devastating elements of the aftermath. The elimination of the nest did not eliminate the research, because the research had already been reproduced and carried away. What Umbrella had built in those years below Raccoon City would not end with Raccoon City's destruction, but that reckoning would come later. For now, the train, the dark, the 3 of them breathing. The train emerged, somewhere outside the city. The nest's exit point was in the industrial outskirts, beyond the immediate perimeter of what had been the military containment zone, in territory that was not yet fully controlled. The morning of October 1st, 1998. 24 hours since they had arrived at the edges of a dying city. 1,000 lifetimes of experience compressed into those hours. The government was waiting, not with the warmth of rescue, with the cold efficiency of an agency that had known what was happening in Raccoon City and had made certain decisions about how to manage it, and whose interest in the survivors was primarily the interest of an institution managing information and consequences. They were alive. They were witnesses. They had been in the SUSI, RCPD, and the Nest, and they had seen things that needed to be carefully accounted for and, where possible, controlled. The weapons were confiscated immediately. The debriefings began quickly. The specific quality of the government's response to Leon and Claire in those first hours, the way their survival was treated as a management problem rather than a human event, tells you something about the institutional culture that had enabled Raccoon City in the first place. Different agency, similar logic. The people in front of you are less important than the information they carry and the risk they pose to whatever narrative is being constructed. Sherry was taken into custody. That is the most honest way to say it, though the official language would have been something gentler, placed under government care, provided with support and protection, connected with resources. She was 12 and orphaned, and the daughter of the man who had created the G-virus, and she had survived G-virus exposure, and these facts made her interesting to people who were interested in those things, for reasons that were not purely humanitarian. Leon and Claire were separated, briefly, in the immediate logistical sense, but the separation had a quality that went beyond logistics. They had been through something together, in the way that changes you and marks you and creates a connection that doesn't require maintenance to remain real. But they were being processed by systems that had no framework for that kind of connection, that were interested in what they had seen and what they could verify and what they would say and how it could be managed. And then, October 1st, 1998. The decision had already been made. The math had been done. The city had been sealed for days. The outbreak had been allowed to progress to a point where the question of containment by conventional means was no longer realistic. And the people who had the authority to make the next decision made it. A thermobaric strike, a specially designed weapon designed to produce a firestorm within the city's boundaries that would eliminate the biological contamination through the simple mechanism of temperature, high enough, sustained enough, that nothing organic survived. Raccoon City burned. 100,000 people had lived there. Most of them were dead already, or in a condition that the official accounting did not classify as living in any meaningful sense. The ones who might have survived, who had barricaded themselves, who were waiting, who had not yet been reached by the outbreak, were killed by the strike along with everything else. The math had been done. The calculation of acceptable losses had been performed. The city was gone. The crater, the geographic consequence of the firestorm, remained. A scar on the landscape of the Arklay mountain region, visible from the air, legible in satellite imagery. Not the kind of thing that could be entirely hidden, though there were efforts. The official narrative in the immediate aftermath was environmental, a catastrophic industrial accident, contamination requiring emergency response. The specific nature of that contamination, the corporation responsible for it, the decisions made by identifiable individuals that had directly produced it, these details were managed, controlled, suppressed with varying degrees of success in the months that followed. Not completely suppressed. The evidence was too distributed, the survivors too numerous, the nature of what had happened too extraordinary to be entirely contained within the parameters of official management. Information leaked. Witnesses talked. Journalists who had been investigating Umbrella before the outbreak continued investigating it after, now with much more compelling evidence to work with. The picture that emerged over subsequent months and years was fragmentary but cumulatively damning, enough to make Umbrella's responsibility for Raccoon City a matter of public record, even if the full depth of it took years to become fully visible. Umbrella as a public entity did not survive Raccoon City for long. The legal and regulatory consequences, the loss of public trust, the specific mechanisms by which a corporation that has been doing what Umbrella had been doing eventually becomes impossible to sustain as a legitimate enterprise. These things played out over the years following 1998 in ways that made the Umbrella Corporation, by the mid-2000s, a legal entity rather than an operational one. The organization, the culture, the network of people who had been part of it, these continued in various forms, embedded in new corporate structures and government relationships, carrying the knowledge and the methods forward under different names. This is, unfortunately, how it usually goes. The institution may be destroyed. The institutional knowledge and the institutional interests and the people who maintain them are much harder to destroy. Leon Kennedy went to work for the government. This was both a natural progression and a deliberate choice. Natural because his skills and his knowledge and his experience made him exactly the kind of person that certain government agencies needed. Deliberate because he had decided, in the process of navigating Raccoon City, that the answer to institutional corruption was not to reject institutions, but to be inside them with open eyes. To know what they were and what they could fail to be, and to refuse, deliberately and continuously, to allow the institution to become the thing that the RCPD had become. He was extraordinarily good at his work. The specific combination of capability and ethics and the clear-eyed understanding of how systems can be corrupted that Raccoon City had given him made him genuinely valuable in ways that the organizations he worked for did not always fully appreciate and did not always fully deserve. He continued encountering the downstream consequences of what Umbrella had built. In subsequent crises, subsequent viral incidents, subsequent demonstrations that the G virus and the T virus had not ended with the destruction of the nest. The research had survived. The interests had survived. The world that Umbrella had been part of creating continued to require exactly the kind of person that Leon Kennedy had become. Claire Redfield went looking for her brother, found him. Chris was alive, had been in Europe, had been dealing with the consequences of the Arclay investigation in his own way, had his own extraordinary story from those years. Their reunion was private, which is as it should be. Some things don't belong in the official record. She didn't stop. This is perhaps the most characteristic thing about Claire in the aftermath. She didn't process Raccoon City as a conclusion. She processed it as an introduction to something that required continued engagement. She became involved in humanitarian work, specifically oriented toward the victims of biohazard incidents. The people who are not the operatives, or the investigators, or the scientists, but the ordinary people who find themselves in the path of extraordinary catastrophe. She carried Raccoon City with her as a specific obligation to the memory of the 100,000 people who had lived in that city, to the knowledge of what had been done to them and why and by whom, and to the conviction that knowledge of this kind obligates action. She kept track of Sherry. This was not an obligation anyone imposed. It was a choice maintained over years, the natural consequence of what had happened between them in the RCPD and the nest. Sherry had Claire's contact. Claire checked in. The relationship between them, across the years that followed, had the quality of the bonds that are formed in the specific crucible of shared extremity. Durable, honest, maintained without the ordinary social scaffolding, because the foundation was already something that the ordinary social scaffolding was built to approach but couldn't quite reach. Sherry grew up, did the work, became the person that the 12-year-old in the nest had the potential to be, capable and clear-eyed, and in possession of a moral compass that had been calibrated by extraordinary experience. She worked with Leon. She remained in contact with Claire. She carried the biological consequences of the G virus exposure through a life that was, by any measure, more than the circumstances of its forming should have permitted. She was fine. She remained fine. Survival, sustained over years, maintained into a life of meaning and agency. This is what fine means in the aftermath of Raccoon City, and the city itself. The crater, the absence, the place where 100,000 people had lived their ordinary lives above an extraordinary secret, where the amber leaves had turned in September, and the clock tower had stood in the center plaza, and the RCPD building had housed its improbable combination of art and law enforcement and hidden passages to the world below. It was gone. The scar in the landscape remained and would remain. The people who had lived there and died there remained in their deaths and in the memory of the ones who had known them, and in the documentary record that was gradually assembled in the years that followed. And the knowledge of what had happened, the specific, documented, attributable knowledge of how Raccoon City had been destroyed and by whom and for what. That knowledge survived in the accounts of people like Leon and Claire and Sherry, who had been inside it and had come out carrying the full weight of it. The story that Raccoon City tells, the story it has always told, since the first pieces of it became publicly known, is a story about trust and its betrayal, about the contract between institutions and the people they exist to serve, and what happens when that contract is violated not through ordinary failure or inadequacy, but through deliberate, sustained, cynical exploitation. About the specific harm that comes from allowing corporate interests to occupy the structures of civic life without accountability, without transparency, without the oversight that is the only mechanism by which that occupation can be caught and corrected before it becomes catastrophic. This is not an abstract lesson. It is not a parable. It happened, in this story's telling, to real people in a real city on real September nights in 1998. 100,000 people who did not know that the company whose logo appeared on their local products and whose representatives attended their civic events had built something below their feet that would, eventually, kill them. They trusted. They were betrayed. And then they were gone. What Leon and Claire and Sherry carried out of Raccoon City, what they carried in their bodies and their knowledge and their choices for years afterward, was not just survival. It was witness. The obligation that comes from being the people who were present, who saw, who know the full shape of what happened. The obligation to not allow the knowledge to be managed away or suppressed or gradually replaced by a version that is more comfortable for the institutions that benefit from the comfortable version. The train had moved through the dark. The three of them had breathed in the aftermath. And then they had gotten off the train and walked into the morning of October 1st, 1998, and begun the process of living in a world that now contained the full weight of what they knew. They carried it. They carry it still, in whatever form still means in the continued chapters of their lives. That is the story of Raccoon City. That is the story of the night it ended, and the years that followed, and the ordinary people who were caught in the machinery of extraordinary institutional failure, and the extraordinary young people who survived it and refused to let it be the last word. The leaves had been amber. The clock tower had stood. The city had been, for a time, a place where people lived. It mattered. All of it, even in its ending, especially in its ending. Rest now, almost. We are not quite finished yet. Section 13. The Umbrella Security Service. The soldiers nobody talks about. There is a category of person in every large institutional catastrophe who tends to get written out of the accounting afterward. Not the architects of the disaster. They are named, documented, prosecuted or not prosecuted, become the faces associated with the thing that happened. Not the victims, they are memorialized, or at least gesture toward memorialization, in the language of tribute that institutions produce when they need to acknowledge loss without accepting responsibility for it. The category that gets written out is the people in the middle, the operatives, the contractors, the individuals who were deployed to execute decisions they didn't make, who operated within a chain of command that they may not have fully understood, and who died or survived carrying knowledge that didn't fit the clean narrative either side preferred. For Raccoon City, this category was the Umbrella Security Service, the USS. And for a specific operation within those 7 days, it was a team-designated Hunks unit, the team that had been sent into the nest on September 22nd with a press and terrible mandate. The USS was Umbrella's private military arm. This is worth taking a moment to fully understand, because private military capability of this kind, a corporation fielding what amounted to a trained special operations force, operating outside any national legal framework, accountable only to corporate command, represents a specific category of institutional danger that Raccoon City demonstrated with particular clarity. Umbrella had built this capability because its research required it. Containing viral outbreaks required military response that couldn't involve public agencies. Protecting research facilities required security that couldn't be subject to public oversight. Suppressing evidence of incidents required the kind of enforcement that couldn't leave legal records. The USS was the answer to all of those requirements. Recruited from former Special Forces personnel across multiple countries, trained at private facilities, equipped at a level that matched or exceeded most national military units, paid well enough that their loyalty to Umbrella's interests was reliable across a range of difficult situations. They were professional soldiers who had chosen to apply their professional skills in a context where the normal frameworks of military ethics, the laws of armed conflict, the accountability to civilian oversight, the chain of command that ultimately connects to some form of democratic legitimacy, did not apply. This choice deserves examination, though it rarely receives it. The men and women of the USS had, in most cases, begun their careers in legitimate military service. They had been trained with the expectations and obligations that come with state military service. At some point, through a decision that was probably gradual rather than sudden, probably involved a meaningful increase in compensation, probably was rationalized in the language of professional skills and market value, and the argument that the work they were doing was essentially the same as before, just for a different employer. They had made the transition to Umbrella's private force. The transition meant something. It meant accepting that the accountability structures that had governed their previous service were now absent, that the missions they would be assigned would not be subject to the oversight that national military operations, however imperfectly, must answer to, that the question of whether an operation was legal or ethical or in any sense defensible to a civilian population was not a question they were required to ask, because there was no mechanism by which the asking would be received or the answer would produce consequences. The Hunk team, the specific unit dispatched to the nest on September 22nd to retrieve the G-virus samples from William Birkin. Hunk, codename, not name, another of the ways in which the institutional culture of private military work strips away the human elements that create accountability, was among the USS's most experienced operators. He had survived missions that had killed everyone else deployed alongside him, enough times that his survival had become something his colleagues attributed to a quality he himself described with ironic detachment. The Grim Reaper's walking companion. Death found everyone around him. He kept walking. The September 22nd mission was, in its parameters, straightforward. Enter the nest through the access points that Umbrella's intelligence had identified. Locate Birkin's laboratory. Retrieve the G-virus samples. All of them. Every documented vial. Neutralize any resistance. Extract and return to Umbrella's custody with the samples intact. The team was good. They moved through the nest's security with the efficiency of people who had been briefed on the facility's layout and who had the technical capability to manage its access systems. They found the laboratory. They found Birkin, alone, as he almost always was at that hour. The lights in the rest of the facility dimmed. The controlled environment of the lab the only fully illuminated space. They shot him. This was the moment. The decision that changed everything, made by someone in a command chain that ran from the trigger to Umbrella's executive structure, processed through the specific ethical vacancy that the USS's operating culture had been designed to produce. Birkin was a civilian, a scientist. He was in his laboratory. He had the samples. He was unwilling to relinquish them voluntarily, and the mission parameters did not include negotiation. So, they shot him and took the samples and moved toward the extraction point. And then the impossible happened. The thing that Hunk's team had not been briefed to expect, perhaps because no one in Umbrella's command structure had quite believed Birkin would do it. The dying scientist on the floor of his laboratory injected himself with the one remaining vial, the one they hadn't found, the last resort. What came out of that laboratory after them was not William Birkin. It was something that wore his outline like a rough sketch and moved with a purposeful violence that reduced most of the team to their component parts in the first encounter. It recovered the stolen samples. It killed and spread its own viral payload through the wounds it inflicted. And the USS soldiers who died in those tunnels on September 22nd began a secondary outbreak within the nest itself. The T-virus in their own blood, reacting with death and dark, and the specific conditions of the facility to start its own quiet catastrophe below the streets of the city above. Hunk survived. Of course he survived. He was always the one who survived. He made his way through the nest in the chaos of that night and the days following, navigating the progressive failure of the facility and the growing population of reanimated dead, and the Birkin thing's continuous movement through the lower levels, carrying a sample he had managed to retain, a fragment, a partial, toward the extraction point that Umbrella had designated. He reached it, he extracted. He delivered the partial sample to Umbrella's waiting transport on the morning of September 29th, the same morning that Leon and Claire were arriving at the city's edges. The sample was incomplete. The formula was partial. It wasn't what Umbrella had sent the team to acquire, but Hunk delivered what he had, which was what he always did. The mission, as much of the mission as the situation permitted, regardless of cost, regardless of what had happened to the people who had gone in with him. The surviving documentation of Hunk's operation in the nest in those 7 days between September 22nd and 29th represents perhaps the most clinical account of the entire catastrophe. He filed reports, detailed, professional, stripped of anything that might be characterized as emotional content. Accounting of personnel losses, not grieving, not contextualizing, just accounting. Assessment of objectives achieved and objectives unachieved. Recommendations for future operations. He reported the deaths of his team members with the same register he used to report that the G virus samples had been only partially recovered. Both were mission parameters. Both were outcomes to be documented and transmitted to command. This is the quality that the USS's institutional culture had produced. The capacity to process the deaths of colleagues and the infection of an entire city and the initiation of an outbreak that would ultimately kill 100,000 people as line items in an operational report. Not out of cruelty. There is no evidence that Hunk was gratuitously cruel in the way that sadism suggests, but out of the specific moral flattening that comes from working within an institutional framework that has no mechanism for registering the weight of human loss. The other USS teams, the broader deployment that Umbrella maintained in Raccoon City during the outbreak, had a more visible presence in the city's final days. Their mandate during the 7-day period was contamination management, which in the USS's vocabulary meant eliminating infected individuals, securing Umbrella's assets within the city, and preventing the spread of information about Umbrella's responsibility. They worked in the same ding city that Leon and Claire were navigating, sometimes crossing paths, operating according to mission parameters that were often in direct conflict with the survival of civilians. Some of them had doubts. The records, fragmentary, gathered from various sources in the aftermath, suggest that not every USS operative in Raccoon City in those 7 days maintained the full clinical detachment that Hunk embodied. Some of them wrote things, notes that didn't make it into official reports, messages to people outside the city that were intercepted by Umbrella's communications monitoring, small acts of deviation from mission parameters that might have been, in another context, called conscience. These deviations were managed, not with subtlety. The institutional culture of the USS had mechanisms for managing operatives who developed reservations about mission parameters, and those mechanisms were not gentle. Several USS operatives did not survive the Raccoon City deployment for reasons that were not directly related to the outbreak. The ones who did survive, who extracted successfully before the October 1st strike, scattered into the post-Raccoon world, carrying their professional knowledge and their operational histories and whatever internal reckoning they were doing privately with the question of what they had been part of. Some of them went on to subsequent deployments with Umbrella or Umbrella-adjacent organizations. Some of them left the private military world entirely. None of them publicly accounted for their role in the events of those 7 days. Hunk continued operating. The records of his subsequent career, in the years after Raccoon City, in the various viral incident responses and intelligence operations that continued to characterize the world that Raccoon City had helped create, suggest a professional who had processed the experience as simply another mission, another set of outcomes to be documented and transmitted, and had continued with the work. He survived those subsequent operations too, as he always did, as he always would. The Grim Reaper's walking companion. The USS and the Hunk story occupy a particular space in the broader Raccoon City narrative. They are the mechanism by which Umbrella's decisions became physical reality on September 22nd. Without the team entering the nest, without the decision to shoot Birkin rather than negotiate with him, the chain reaction might not have been triggered in that specific way on that specific night. The outbreak might have been delayed. The circumstances that produced Leon and Claire's arrival on September 29th might have been different, or they might not. The research was already what it was. The conditions for catastrophe had already been built, over years, by the decisions that had produced the nest and the G virus and the culture of secrecy and the corruption of Raccoon City's civic institutions. The Hunk operation was the specific trigger, but the explosive conditions predated it by decades. What the USS story adds to the accounting of Raccoon City is a reminder that catastrophes of this kind require human hands at every stage, not just the architects, Spencer, the early Umbrella leadership, the researchers who built the viral weapons, not just the corruptors, Irons, the city officials who had been cultivated and compromised over years, but the operators, the people in the field doing the physical work that the decisions required, pulling triggers, filing reports, extracting from dying cities with their partial samples and their operational assessments and their very carefully maintained emotional distance from the full weight of what they had been part of. These people made choices. The choices were not made in ignorance. They were made with professional knowledge of what the institution they served was doing and why. The professional distance doesn't change the nature of the choice. It only makes the choice easier to live with, which may be exactly why the institutional culture that produced the USS was designed to provide that distance in the first place. Section 14. The science beneath the horror. What the viruses actually were. There is a version of the Raccoon City story that never examines the actual biology, that treats the T virus and the G virus as given, as the established premise of the horror, rather than as things that require examination in their own right. This version of the story is incomplete in a specific way, because understanding what these agents actually were, at the level of their biological mechanisms, is essential to understanding why Umbrella was so invested in developing them, why the research had the urgency it had, and why the outcomes were as terrible as they were. The T virus, tyrant virus. The designation came from the research program that first refined it, the Tyrant Project, an attempt to create a controllable supersolid organism using viral modification. The name is misleading in retrospect, because the T virus, as it was eventually understood, was not primarily about the tyrant organisms it could in theory produce under very specific conditions. It was about what it did to everything else. The T virus was derived from the progenitor virus, the naturally occurring pathogen found in Africa in the late 1960s, through a series of modifications that Umbrella's researchers had developed over approximately 2 decades. The progenitor was already extraordinary, a naturally occurring pathogen with the capacity to interact with host DNA in ways that normal viruses do not. Normal viruses replicate. They insert their genetic material into host cells and force those cells to produce more copies of the virus. They are, in a fundamental sense, selfish genetic information, sequences of nucleotides organized around the single imperative of self-replication. The progenitor did something more. It didn't just replicate inside host cells, it modified them. It incorporated portions of its own genetic sequence into the host's DNA, making permanent changes that were heritable and that altered the host's cellular function in ways that persisted after the acute infection phase. This property, called mutagenic retroviral integration in the technical literature of subsequent research, is what made the progenitor so significant to Spencer and his colleagues when they discovered it. The T virus was the progenitor refined, the mutagenic properties amplified, the replication rate increased, the host range expanded to cover an extraordinarily broad array of organisms. The T virus could infect mammals, insects, plant matter, organisms that had no normal vulnerability to a pathogen that evolved to infect one species of primate, found themselves susceptible to the T virus because the virus had been engineered to interface with biological systems at a level more fundamental than species-specific immune recognition. What it did to human hosts was what the residents of Raccoon City experienced. The virus attacked the central nervous system. It disrupted the normal operation of the brain's higher functions, the prefrontal cortex, the regions responsible for judgment and language, and the complex social cognition that constitutes personhood in the neurological sense. It left the brainstem and the limbic system more intact, which meant that what remained after the higher functions were disrupted was a creature that could move, that oriented towards stimuli, that experienced something like hunger and something like aggression, but that had none of the things that made it a person before. The reanimation property was the most extraordinary and the most difficult to understand. The T virus didn't just create this state in living hosts, it created it in recently deceased hosts. The mechanism involved a last resort viral activation of mitochondrial function in cells that would normally be irreversibly dead within minutes of the heart stopping. The virus, in the biological logic of a pathogen that needs living tissue to replicate, had developed the capacity to restart the most basic cellular machinery in tissue that had just lost the systemic support of a beating heart. The results were not truly alive. The reanimated dead lacked the integrated function of a living organism, could not digest food normally, could not regulate temperature, could not heal from damage in the way living tissue does. But they could move, they could pursue, they could transmit. The transmission mechanism was the public health catastrophe that the RCPD and the city's emergency services had encountered on those first calls to the Western Residential District. The T-virus transmitted through saliva, through the bite that the reanimated dead, operating on predatory tropism, delivered to the living people they encountered. Transmission was efficient enough that a single infected individual in a populated area could produce a secondary outbreak within hours. The bite-to-infection rate in the Raccoon City outbreak was extraordinarily high because the T-virus strains circulating in the water supply had already adapted to the local population's immune profile. And the water supply transmission was its own category of horror. Unlike the direct contact transmission of the bite, the water supply route produced a slow, progressive infection that was symptomatic of ordinary illness in its early stages: fever, fatigue, nausea. People who had been drinking Raccoon City water in those first days after September 22nd were experiencing a viral infection that felt like flu before it became something else. They went to the hospital, they called their doctors, they stayed home in bed. The incubation period gave the infection time to spread further before the nature of it became apparent. The G-virus. The contrast between the T-virus and the G-virus, when you examine them carefully, is the contrast between a weapon that had escaped its designer's intentions and a weapon that was specifically, deliberately designed for something beyond what the T-virus could achieve. The T-virus produced the reanimated dead, effective as a terror weapon, catastrophically difficult to control once released, ultimately too indiscriminate to be useful as anything other than area denial or mass casualty production. The military applications that Umbrella had explored with the T-virus were limited by this indiscriminacy. The G-virus was supposed to be different. The G-virus was supposed to produce something that could be directed, a transformed individual who retained enough cognitive function to be controlled, who possessed the extraordinary physical capabilities that the G-virus's mutation produced, and who could be deployed with purpose rather than simply released and allowed to destroy everything in its radius. This ambition was Birkin's contribution, his refinement of the G-virus concept from the raw material he had isolated from Lisa Trevor towards something with military applications that Umbrella could actually sell. The idea that a G-virus host could be a controlled weapon was always partially aspirational. The virus's tendency to drive continuous mutation made stable control extremely difficult, but it was real enough as a theoretical possibility to motivate years of research and enormous investment. The G-virus host, the G-mutant, underwent changes that defied normal biological logic. The transformation was not linear and did not approach a stable endpoint. It was continuous, driven by the virus's imperative to modify and enhance host biology in whatever direction seemed to maximize survival fitness. New limbs, additional sensory organs, calcified defensive structures, mass increases that violated normal metabolic constraints. The G-mutant's biology was, in the most precise sense, improvised, a real-time experiment in what cellular life could become when freed from the evolutionary conservatism that normally constrains biological change. The G-mutant also reproduced. This was among the most disturbing properties of the G-virus, the property that made the Birkin situation in the nest particularly terrible. The G-virus implantation mechanism, the embryo that the Birkin thing implanted in Sherry, the same mechanism that had been documented in other encounters during the nest's final days, was a reproductive strategy. The virus produced an embryo that, inserted into a compatible host, would begin the transformation process. If the host's biology was incompatible, and most were, the embryo would trigger rapid catastrophic organ failure rather than successful transformation. If compatible, the embryo would grow and transform the host from the inside. The devil vaccine that Claire found in the nest's records was the product of research that Birkin himself had authorized, not because he intended to use it, but because any responsible biosafety protocol for a facility working with the G-virus required the development of a counter-agent against accidental exposure. The irony of that Birkin's own commitment to laboratory safety protocol had produced the thing that saved his daughter from what he had become, is the kind of detail that resists any clean narrative frame. The broader viral taxonomy that Umbrella had developed over its operational history, The multiple strains, the hybrids, the organisms created by viral modification that fell into categories beyond the simple T virus and G virus designations, speaks to the scope of what had been built in the various research facilities over the decades. Raccoon City and the Nest were the best documented cases, the ones that became public through the events of 1998. But they were not the only cases. The research had been distributed across multiple facilities, multiple countries, multiple research programs running in parallel. What had been built, in total, across the history of Umbrella's viral research was a catalog of biological weapons with no parallel in documented history. Not the crude chemical agents of earlier centuries, not the relatively simple bacterial weapons of 20th century programs, but genuinely novel biological entities, organisms and agents engineered to produce specific effects in host populations, developed with the full sophistication of late 20th century molecular biology, refined through decades of experimentation on human subjects. Understanding this scale matters for understanding the aftermath of Raccoon City. The destruction of the city and the Nest did not eliminate this catalog. It eliminated one research facility and one documented outbreak. The knowledge existed in other places, in other hands, in the research notes that Ada had carried out of the Nest, and in the memories of the researchers who had survived various Umbrella facilities over the years, and in the various successor organizations that inherited Umbrella's networks when the corporation itself was no longer viable. The specific biology, the T virus mechanism, the G virus properties, the devil vaccine formula, the broader principles of viral engineering that Umbrella had developed, all of this moved forward from Raccoon City into whatever came next, not as institutional Umbrella research, as knowledge in the world, available to anyone with the resources and the interest to pursue it. This is what makes the scientific legacy of what happened in Raccoon City so significant and so frightening. Biological knowledge, once produced, is essentially impossible to unlearn. The specific advances in viral engineering that Umbrella had achieved were not dependent on the continued existence of Umbrella. They were dependent on the existence of the people who understood them and the research records that documented them. And those people and those records survived Raccoon City's destruction. The world that followed, the subsequent viral incidents in various locations, the continuing efforts of various organizations to acquire and develop biological weapons using the principles Umbrella had pioneered, was the direct scientific legacy of what had been built in the Nest. Not a continuation of Umbrella's institutional program, a continuation of Umbrella's scientific achievement, carried forward by different people with different names and different institutional affiliations, but the same fundamental knowledge base. This is the dark scientific epilogue of what happened in that underground laboratory. The city burned. The facility was destroyed. The knowledge kept moving. Section 15. What the story means. Raccoon City and the world after we come to the end now. Not with a summary. The story has been told. The threads have been followed. The people and the places and the mechanisms of the catastrophe have been examined with as much care as they deserve. What we come to, at the end, is the question of what it means. Not as abstraction, not as academic exercise, but as the practical reckoning that every story of this kind demands. What does it mean? What does it tell us about the world we actually live in? What do we carry from it when we set it down? The Raccoon City story is, in its bones, a story about accountability, or rather about its absence, about the extraordinary and systematic lengths to which the institution at its center went to prevent accountability from functioning. Umbrella understood accountability as an obstacle to be managed rather than a mechanism of governance to be honored. This understanding shaped every decision the corporation made over its operational history, the secrecy, the corruption, the private military capability, the cultivation of civic officials, the compartmentalized research culture that prevented any individual from knowing the full picture of what they were participating in. All of it was accountability management in the most fundamental sense, and for a long time it worked. This is the most uncomfortable part of the Raccoon City story, in some ways. Not that the system of accountability suppression was built, because systems like this are built whenever power and financial interest are aligned against transparency. The uncomfortable part is how well it worked, for how long, decades, during which the research proceeded, the people were tested, the children in the orphanage were used, The civic life of the city was systematically corrupted, and nothing, no investigation, no whistleblower, no regulatory process, no journalistic inquiry, produced the accountability that should have followed. Why? Not because the people who should have been asking questions were incompetent, not because the evidence wasn't there to find, at least in fragments, but because the institutional architecture that Umbrella had built, the bribes, the connections, the managed narratives, the placement of its own people in positions of oversight, had specifically designed itself to prevent the connections from being made, to ensure that each fragment of evidence existed in a context that prevented it from being assembled into the larger picture. This architecture is recognizable. It is not unique to a fictional corporation in a fictional city. The specific mechanisms Umbrella used, regulatory capture, media management, the cultivation of public officials, the use of private security to enforce compliance, the compartmentalization of knowledge to prevent whistleblowing, these are the standard toolkit of institutional corruption at scale. They appear in the histories of real corporations, real regulatory failures, real disasters that were preventable and weren't prevented because the systems that should have prevented them had been compromised. Raccoon City is, from this angle, not a warning about biological weapons per se. It's a warning about the specific failure mode of accountability, about what happens when the institutions that are supposed to exercise oversight over dangerous activities are themselves captured by the interests they're supposed to regulate. The biology is the dramatic surface. The institutional failure is the deeper mechanism. The people who survived Raccoon City, Leon and Claire and Sherry, and the few others who made it through those 7 days, carried this knowledge into whatever came next. Not just the knowledge of what had happened, but the knowledge of how it had happened. The understanding that the failure was not random, not accidental, not the result of individual bad choices in isolation, but the product of a system that had been built, deliberately and over time, to fail in exactly the way that it did. This is a specific and important kind of knowledge. It is the knowledge that makes it possible to recognize the early stages of the pattern, to see, before the catastrophe is complete, the signs that the accountability mechanisms are being compromised, and the questions that should be asked are not being asked, and the evidence that should be accumulating toward consequences is being managed away. The knowledge that makes it possible to intervene before the chain reaction is triggered, before the lab below the city has been there for years, and the mayor's office has been cultivated, and the police chief has been bought. Leon spent the years after Raccoon City doing work that was informed by exactly this knowledge. He was not naive about institutions after Raccoon City. He was never naive about institutions again. But he was also not nihilistic, which would be the easy response, the understandable response. Instead, he occupied the harder position, the position of someone who understands clearly what institutions can fail to be, while maintaining the conviction that functioning institutions are still better than their absence, and that the work of making them function is worth doing even when, especially when, the evidence of their failure is recent and overwhelming. Claire's work with humanitarian organizations had the same quality. She was not someone who believed the systems were fine. She was someone who had seen, with unusual directness and clarity, what the systems looked like when they weren't fine, and who had decided that the appropriate response was not to withdraw but to engage, to be inside the conversation, to be the person who was asking the questions and following the evidence and refusing to accept the managed narrative. Sherry, the child who had been the unwitting center of everything, the 12-year-old who had carried the G-virus formula in a locket around her neck through the night the city ended, grew into an adult whose professional choices were shaped by a fundamental understanding that the world contains institutional dangers of the kind that had destroyed Raccoon City, and that the appropriate response to this knowledge is not fear, but competence. The specific, rigorous, practically grounded competence that makes it possible to be useful in the face of exactly those dangers. There is something that the Raccoon City story does that most disaster narratives don't do, or don't do as clearly. It names the specific people responsible, not in an anonymous, systemic way, not as the gesture toward unnamed corporate interests that is the usual mode of disaster accountability. It names them. Spencer built Umbrella. Birkin built the G-virus and made the choice to inject himself. Irons took the money and suppressed the information. The USS operatives pulled the triggers on September 22nd. The government officials who sealed the city and chose the thermobaric strike made those choices. These are individuals, with names and histories and specific moments at which they made specific choices that contributed to a specific outcome. The systemic analysis is important. The systems that enabled these choices, the institutional architecture that made them possible, the culture that normalized them. But the systemic analysis is not a substitute for the individual accounting. Both are true simultaneously. The system enabled the catastrophe, and the individuals made it happen, and both levels of truth are necessary for the full accounting. This is the hardest part of any disaster reckoning, maintaining both levels at once, not allowing the systemic analysis to become an excuse for individual choices, not allowing the focus on individual choices to become a substitute for understanding the systems that produce them. Raccoon City was a systemic failure, and it was also Brian Irons taking money and William Birkin injecting himself, and Spencer building a corporation organized around the premise that human beings were acceptable research material. All of it, simultaneously. What do we do with a story like this one? With the knowledge of Raccoon City, whatever form that knowledge takes, the official record, the survivor accounts, the classified documentation that will eventually be declassified if the historical pattern holds? The same thing you do with any knowledge of how terrible things happen. You pay attention. You remain skeptical, in the specific productive sense of skepticism that doesn't prevent engagement but requires evidence before trust. You ask questions about the institutions in your life, the ones that are supposed to protect you, the ones whose accountability structures are supposed to be functioning, and you treat evasion and opacity not as neutral characteristics, but as information in themselves. You notice when the people who are supposed to be asking questions have stopped asking them. You notice when the official narrative has a quality of too much smoothness, too much consistency, too many coincidental absences of the details that would be most damaging. You notice when the experts are unavailable, and the oversight bodies are finding nothing, and the investigative stories are being killed before they run. You notice, and then you tell someone. And then you do it again, and you keep doing it, because the architecture of accountability is not self-maintaining. It requires the continuous attention of people who have decided that maintaining it is worth their effort, even when the effort is unrewarded, even when the questions are met with management rather than answers, even when the knowledge you carry feels too heavy for the single person carrying it. Leon Kennedy carries it, Claire Redfield carries it, Sherry Birkin carries it. You carry it now, having sat with this story for however long it's taken to reach this end. That's enough. That's exactly enough. The story tells itself, in the end, through the people who refuse to let it be forgotten, who insist on the full accounting, who name the names and trace the mechanisms and refuse to let the official narrative's smoothness stand in for the actual, complicated, devastating truth. Raccoon City is gone. The crater remains. The leaves no longer turn there in September. But the knowledge of it, the full, unmanaged, unsmoothed knowledge of what it was and what was done to it and why, that knowledge is still here, in the accounts, in the testimonies, in the stories that get told, at length, in the dark, to people who are willing to sit with them. In this one, rest now, the city has been accounted for. The people who lived in it, and the people who survived it, and the people who destroyed it have all been named, as completely as the record allows. The lights can come down. The story is told. And if this is the kind of deep dive you find yourself settling into, if you're the kind of person who wants the full picture, who wants to understand not just what happened, but how and why, then you already know what to do. Leave a comment. Tell us what you're thinking about. Tell us what part of the story stayed with you longest. Tell us what you want to explore next. There are more stories where this one came from. There always are. Like the video if it reached you. Subscribe if you want to come back. And take care of yourselves out there, in whatever city you're in. End of script. A final note on why this story still matters. There is one last thing worth saying. Something that often goes unsaid in the accounting of events like Raccoon City because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories of cause and effect, of perpetrators and victims, of institutional failure and individual heroism. The people of Raccoon City were not naive. They were not foolish. They were not less observant or less intelligent or less capable of moral judgment than the people reading or listening to this account. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that had, through processes largely invisible to them, been organized against their interests by people who had the resources and the motive to keep that organization invisible. This matters because one of the most persistent and most damaging responses to catastrophes of this kind is the implication, sometimes explicit, usually implicit, that the victim should have known, should have seen the signs, should have been more skeptical, more vigilant, more resistant to the comfortable assumptions of daily life in a place that felt like home. This implication transfers moral weight from the people who built the deception to the people who were deceived by it, and it does so in a way that serves exactly the institutional interests that built the deception in the first place. If the victim should have known, then the institutions and individuals who created the conditions of unknowing are somewhat less culpable. This reasoning is wrong. The people of Raccoon City trusted the city they lived in because that is what people do in cities that function. They extend provisional trust to the institutions that are supposed to be operating on their behalf, because the alternative is a kind of comprehensive paranoia that makes ordinary life impossible, and that is itself a kind of defeat. The trust was not a failure of judgment. The trust was human. The betrayal of that trust, the deliberate, sustained, financially motivated betrayal of the basic premise of the civic contract, was the failure. And that failure belonged to the people who enacted it. Spencer, Irons, the various architects of a system specifically designed to convert that ordinary human trust into compliance with something that was in every meaningful sense working against the people who trusted it. The 100,000 people of Raccoon City deserved better. Not as an abstract statement about what people in general deserve, but as a specific judgment about what was owed to them by the institutions that claimed their trust and used it against them. They deserve the functioning oversight and the honest civic governance and the accountability structures that their taxes paid for and that their votes were supposed to produce, and that, through the specific corruption that Umbrella had built into the city's institutional life, they did not receive. They deserved better, and they did not get it, and they are gone. Remembering this, really remembering it, not as historical record, but as human reality, the reality of 100,000 people who lived and loved and went about their days in a city that was quietly being used against them, is the last obligation that this story places on everyone who encounters it. Not grief, necessarily, not the performance of mourning for people we never knew, but the refusal to let the accounting stop at the level of mechanism and forget the people the mechanism consumed. Leon and Claire and Sherry survived. The story of the night they survived is extraordinary and worth telling in full, which is what we have tried to do here. But the larger story, the story of the city, of the people who did not survive, of the institutional betrayal that made their deaths not only possible, but, in a certain grim sense, inevitable once the chain had been set in motion, that story is equally important and equally worth the full weight of its telling. So, we end here, with both things present. The extraordinary survival of 3 young people who faced something unsurvivable and came through it, and the irreversible loss of everyone who did not. Both are part of the truth. Neither is sufficient without the other. That is Raccoon City. That is what it was and what was done to it. The lights come down. The story is complete. Thank you for being here.